The orders came through on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1924. Routine military correspondence, the kind that crosses 1,000 desks in 1,000 offices across defeated Germany, except this particular memorandum, buried in the Reichswehr archives until its discovery in 1998, contained a single paragraph that would set in motion events leading to horrors no one could yet imagine. Research into enhancement of human physical capacity for military application to be conducted in cooperation with Soviet facilities. Parameters to remain classified. The signature at the bottom belonged to a mid-level officer whose name history has otherwise forgotten. But here's what the records don't tell us. What specific research did that order authorize? The files from the Soviet side of this cooperation were either destroyed or remain sealed in Russian military archives to this day. We know German officers traveled to remote facilities beyond the Urals. We know they returned with reports that impressed their superiors enough to continue the program for 6 years. What we don't know is what they saw there, or what they learned. This is where it begins. Not with the obvious evil of concentration camps, but with a question whispered in the corridors of military planning offices across post-war Europe. If we cannot field more soldiers than our enemies, can we field better ones? The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, wasn't just a peace agreement. It was a systematic dismantling of German military power. The army, once numbering over 4 million men, was reduced to exactly 100,000 soldiers, barely enough to maintain internal order, let alone defend borders. No tanks, no military aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery. The proud German General Staff, which had orchestrated campaigns across 3 continents, was dissolved entirely. 2 million German soldiers lay dead in the mud of France and Belgium. The Kaiser had fled to the Netherlands. The economy was in free fall, with inflation turning life savings into worthless paper. In the officers' clubs and military academies, the question burned like acid. How had the most sophisticated military machine in Europe been defeated? The answer many seized upon was simple, seductive, and wrong. They hadn't lost militarily, they insisted. They'd been betrayed from within by socialists, by communists, by those who signed the armistice while armies still stood in the field. The stab-in-the-back myth took root, and with it came a dangerous corollary. If Germany had been betrayed rather than beaten, then the next war could be won. All they needed was the right preparation. But here's what's documented and what's merely whispered. The official military records from the Weimar period focus on tactical training, defensive strategies, compliance with treaty limitations. They describe a neutered force, stripped of offensive capability, existing merely to maintain order. Standard historical interpretation. Except scattered through personal correspondence, through diary entries discovered decades later, through the occasional unguarded comment in memoirs written in old age, comes a different picture. German officers weren't accepting defeat. They were learning from it. In 1922, a treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union opened unexpected doors. The Treaty of Rapallo, publicly focused on trade and diplomatic relations, contained secret military protocols. Both nations were international pariahs, Germany defeated, the Soviets revolutionary outcasts. They found common cause in circumventing restrictions placed upon them. The Soviets needed German military expertise, particularly in aviation and chemical weapons. The Germans needed somewhere to conduct research banned by the treaty. Remote facilities appeared in the Soviet Union, officially agricultural research stations or industrial test sites. Unofficially, places where German officers could experiment with forbidden weapons and tactics. Chemical weapons testing at Tomka, tank development at Kazan, aviation training at Lipetsk. These programs are documented, studied, written about in military histories. What's less discussed, buried deeper in the archives, are the medical research facilities that appeared alongside the weapons testing. Small installations staffed by German doctors working with Soviet physicians, studying how soldiers could be made more resilient to the weapons being tested nearby. How much pain can the human body endure before combat effectiveness fails? At what temperature does hypothermia render a soldier unable to fight? How long can men march without sleep before judgment fails? These are practical questions, tactical questions, the kind military medicine has always asked. The difference, and it's a crucial one, lies in methodology. How do you answer these questions? Do you study battlefield casualties and accident victims, building knowledge from tragedy? Or do you conduct experiments? The records from these early Soviet-German facilities are fragmentary. Most documentation was destroyed when the cooperation ended in the early 1930s. The Soviets had no interest in preserving evidence of their collaboration with fascists once Hitler came to power. The Germans later had every reason to hide what they'd learned in Soviet territory. But fragments survive. Purchase orders for medical equipment sent to facilities with no listed hospital, correspondence referencing test subjects in locations supposedly devoted to chemical weapons research. A single photograph, discovered in a deceased officer's effects in 2003, showing men in military uniforms standing outside a building that records claim didn't exist. The pattern suggests something happened in those remote Soviet facilities. Something that taught German military doctors where the boundaries of human endurance lay. Something that, perhaps, taught them that those boundaries could be found through deliberate testing rather than careful observation. We know what came after. The question that shadows the historical record is, did it start here, in the secret cooperation between two pariah states, years before concentration camps and systematic horror? While military planners conducted their forbidden research beyond Soviet borders, a parallel transformation was occurring within German society itself. The transformation of medicine from healing art into instrument of state power. This part is thoroughly documented. We can trace it in medical journals, in university curricula, in law and policy. What's harder to trace is how an entire profession convinced itself this was not merely acceptable but necessary. The concept of eugenics, selective breeding to improve the human species, wasn't German in origin. American scientists promoted it enthusiastically in the early 20th century. British intellectuals embraced it. Across the industrialized world, the idea gained respectability. Human beings could be improved through the same principles that improved livestock. Selective breeding, preventing the unfit from reproducing, creating conditions where only the strongest genetic lines survived. In the United States, 32 states passed forced sterilization laws targeting criminals, the feeble-minded, and those deemed genetically defective. By 1927, the Supreme Court upheld these laws in Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Sweden, Canada, Switzerland all implemented eugenic policies. This was mainstream scientific thought, not fringe theory. German doctors embraced eugenics with particular enthusiasm. In the 1920s, as the Weimar Republic struggled with economic chaos, universities began teaching racial hygiene as established science. Medical students attended lectures explaining how certain ethnic groups carried inferior genetics, how allowing them to reproduce threatened the national health. These weren't secret doctrines whispered in dark corners. They were taught in amphitheaters at prestigious universities, written about in respected journals, discussed openly in medical conferences. The transformation occurred gradually enough that few noticed they were crossing ethical boundaries. One year, doctors treat patients regardless of background. The next year, lectures on racial differences appear in medical school curricula. The year after, papers are published suggesting certain groups pose genetic threats. Then someone proposes sterilizing the mentally ill, just the severely affected, just those who would pass on debilitating conditions. It's merciful, really, preventing suffering, protecting the race's health. By the time Hitler came to power in January 1933, significant portions of the German medical profession were prepared, even eager to serve the state's racial agenda. They'd spent a decade being taught that medicine wasn't just about healing individuals. It was about protecting the genetic health of the entire nation. Some diseases, they'd learned, came not from germs or injury but from heredity. And if you could prevent hereditary disease from spreading, well, wasn't that the ultimate form of medicine? The law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring passed just 6 months after Hitler became Chancellor. July 1933. It mandated sterilization for anyone suffering from conditions deemed hereditary: schizophrenia, epilepsy, severe alcoholism, physical deformity, blindness, deafness. Genetic health courts were established to evaluate cases and order procedures. 400,000 Germans were sterilized over the next decade, not in secret, not in hidden facilities, in regular hospitals, by regular doctors, following standard medical procedures. The operations were documented in hospital records, reported to health authorities, included in doctors' caseload statistics for career advancement purposes. This is documented history. What's less examined in those documents is how the doctors felt about it. Did they believe they were preventing suffering? Did they question the criteria that turned poverty or depression into genetic defects, warranting sterilization? Did they worry about the expansion of categories, how alcoholism and moral deficiency became hereditary conditions? Some doctors refused to participate. We have records of physicians who declined to perform sterilizations, citing ethical concerns. Interestingly, most faced no significant consequences for their refusal. They were reassigned, perhaps passed over for promotion, but not imprisoned or killed. This detail matters because it contradicts the later defense offered by Nazi doctors, that they had no choice, that refusal meant death. The doctors who did participate, the vast majority, left few records of their reasoning. Medical case files describe procedures, outcomes, legal justifications. They don't include the physician's private thoughts. Did they truly believe they were protecting the German race? Or did career advancement and social pressure simply make participation easier than principled resistance? The official story is that Nazi ideology corrupted medicine. The truth, perhaps, is more disturbing. Medicine was ready to be corrupted, already halfway there before Hitler ever took power. Heinrich Himmler cuts an almost absurd figure in the early days of the Nazi regime. Son of a schoolteacher, failed chicken farmer, devoted to astrology and homeopathy and mystical theories about ancient Germanic tribes. He wears small round glasses and has a weak chin. Nothing about him suggests the architect of genocide. But Himmler possesses something more dangerous than physical intimidation. He's a true believer in Nazi racial mysticism, and Hitler trusts him absolutely. In January 1929, Hitler appoints him Reichsführer SS, leader of the Schutzstaffel, the elite protection squad that will grow from a few hundred men into an organization controlling concentration camps, running industrial enterprises, fielding military divisions, and conducting human experiments on a scale never before attempted. Himmler's obsession is creating the perfect Aryan, not through normal breeding alone that would take generations. He wants to accelerate the process, to recover abilities he believes ancient Germanic warriors possessed. In his imagination, fed by pseudo-archaeological texts and mystical theories, the ancient Germans were a super race, taller, stronger, more intelligent, capable of enduring hardships that would kill lesser peoples. In July 1935, Himmler establishes the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Society. Officially, it exists to research Germanic history and prehistory. In practice, it becomes a vehicle for Himmler's wildest theories. Expeditions travel to Tibet, searching for evidence that Aryans originated in Central Asia. Teams excavate ancient Germanic sites, looking for proof of advanced ancient technology. Scholars are funded to prove that every significant human achievement, from Greek philosophy to Chinese inventions, actually originated with Germanic peoples, whose contributions were later stolen or forgotten. This would be comical if it weren't deadly serious. The Ahnenerbe receives substantial funding, prestigious academic support, Himmler's personal attention. More critically, it establishes a precedent that science can be bent to serve ideological conclusions, rather than testing them. That research exists to confirm what ideology claims, rather than to discover what evidence suggests. By the late 1930s, the Ahnenerbe is funding medical research, studies on how to select perfect specimens for SS breeding programs, investigation of ancient partics, medical techniques that might offer advantages over modern medicine, research into whether meditation or mental training can enhance physical performance beyond normal limits. And here's where documentation becomes interesting. The Anunnurbe's records were largely destroyed in the war's final days. Buildings burned, files scattered, leadership either dead or fleeing. What survives is fragmentary: budget documents, personnel files, correspondence about administrative matters. The actual research findings, the reports from expeditions, the data from experiments, the conclusions drawn from studies, those are mostly missing. We know the Anunnurbe conducted medical research. We can trace funding allocations, facility locations, personnel assignments. We know certain doctors worked for the organization. What we don't know is what they actually did. The gap in the historical record is precisely where the most important questions lie. Some experiments are documented elsewhere, particularly those conducted in concentration camps after 1941. Those leave evidence: survivor testimony, occasional preserved documents, the experiments themselves too large-scale to hide completely. But the earlier work, the research in the late 1930s before war began, before concentration camps became the primary research sites, that exists mostly as shadows in archived budgets and cryptic references in correspondence. A letter from 1938, discovered in an East German archive in 1994, references the subjects provided for altitude testing. This is 3 years before documented high-altitude experiments began at Dachau. Where did this earlier testing occur? Who were the subjects? The letter provides no answers. It merely confirms that something was happening before the better-known horrors began. A budget allocation from 1937 includes funds for procurement of materials for resistance studies. The language is bureaucratic, vague enough to mean almost anything. Medical supplies? Test subjects? The facility receiving the funds was demolished in an Allied bombing raid in 1944. Whatever records it contained burned with it. These fragments suggest the possibility, not proof, but possibility that the experimentation began earlier than generally acknowledged, that before the concentration camps became laboratories, before the systematic horror of the 1940s, there was a learning period, a time when methods were developed, when ethical boundaries were first crossed, when doctors began transforming from healers into something else entirely. The official timeline has experiments beginning in 1941 at Dachau. Clear, documented, supported by extensive evidence. The shadow timeline, the one hinted at in fragmentary records and missing files, suggests it might have started years earlier, in facilities that no longer exist, with victims who left no trace. History records what survives. What didn't survive raises questions that may never be answered. The doctors were young, ambitious, brilliant. Josef Mengele graduates with his medical degree in 1938, having studied under some of Germany's most prestigious professors. His dissertation on genetic factors in cleft palate earns praise for its rigor and detail. He's 27 years old, at the beginning of what should be a distinguished career in medical research. Sigmund Rascher completes his medical studies and joins the Luftwaffe Medical Corps. He's particularly interested in aviation medicine, how the human body responds to altitude, pressure changes, extreme temperatures. Legitimate field, important for aviation safety. He writes proposals for research studies, suggests experiments that might help pilots survive crashes in cold water or at high altitude. Karl Clauberg establishes himself as a gynecologist, publishing papers on fertility and reproductive medicine. His work on hormonal treatments for infertility gains recognition. He opens a private clinic, builds a respectable practice, contributes to medical journals. By all conventional measures, these are normal doctors at the start of normal careers. Nothing in their backgrounds suggests they'll become monsters. That's what makes their stories so deeply unsettling. They aren't aberrations. They're products of the system that trained them, shaped by the society that educated them, responding to the opportunities and pressures their time presented. Mengele joins the Nazi Party in 1937. Not unusual, millions of Germans joined for career reasons, social pressure, genuine belief, or simple convenience. He joins the SS in 1938. More significant, but still not definitive. The SS is prestigious, offers opportunities for advancement, attracts ambitious young men from good families. In 1940, Mengele volunteers for the Waffen-SS, the military branch. He serves on the Eastern Front, is wounded, receives medals for bravery. He's 29 years old, a decorated veteran with impeccable credentials. When he applies for a position at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin, studying genetics and racial hygiene, he's exactly the kind of candidate such institutions seek. The records from this period paint a picture of a methodical, ambitious researcher pursuing legitimate scientific questions within the framework of Nazi racial theory. He's not openly sadistic, he's not a raving madman, he's a product of his education and his time, advancing his career within the system available to him. In May 1943, he transfers to Auschwitz. This is presented in his records as a routine posting, another assignment for an SS doctor. 3 years later, he'll be the most wanted war criminal in the world, his name synonymous with medical atrocity. But at the moment of transfer, he's simply a 32-year-old doctor taking up a new position. The transformation from healer to torturer doesn't happen overnight. It occurs through a series of incremental steps, each one justified, each one building on the last. First, you accept that some lives have less value than others. Then you accept that those lesser lives can be used for the greater good. Then you accept that the greater good includes advancing your own career. Then you accept that the discomfort of subjects is regrettable but necessary for scientific progress. Then there are no boundaries left. The question that haunts anyone studying these men is simple and terrifying. Could I have made the same choices? Given the same education, the same social pressures, the same career incentives, the same ideological framework, would I have refused? Or would I, like most German doctors, have found reasons why participation was acceptable? The comfortable answer is that these men were uniquely evil, that normal people would never make such choices. The evidence suggests otherwise. They were normal people who made terrible choices, step by incremental step, until they'd travelled so far down the dark path that returning became impossible. On September 1, 1939, German forces invade Poland. World War II begins. Within 2 days, special SS units called Einsatzgruppen follow the advancing army, tasked with eliminating potential resistance leaders, intellectuals, and Jews. The killing happens immediately, systematically, documented in reports sent back to Berlin. But alongside the military conquest and the mass shootings, another process begins: the construction of camps. Initially framed as labor camps, places to hold prisoners of war and political enemies. As occupation spreads Poland, then France, then Yugoslavia and Greece, then into the Soviet Union, the camp network expands. Auschwitz opens in June 1940, Majdanek in October 1941, Treblinka in July 1942. The official purpose is imprisonment, forced labor, elimination of enemies. But from early on, doctors are assigned to these camps, not just to treat guards or staff, not just to select prisoners capable of work. They're there to conduct research, medical research, scientific investigation using subjects who have no choice, no rights, no value except as experimental materials. The transition from forced sterilization programs to lethal experimentation occurs gradually enough that, again, few notice they're crossing a line. If you can sterilize people without consent because they're genetically defective, can't you also study disease progression in them? If they're going to die anyway in the camp, isn't it wasteful not to learn something from their deaths? If military necessity demands knowledge about Cold War survival, and prisoners are available as subjects, isn't it logical to use them? Each small step builds on the previous. Each crossing of an ethical boundary makes the next crossing easier. The doctors performing these experiments don't see themselves as evil. They see themselves as practical, as serving their nation, as making difficult choices that weak-willed physicians might refuse, but that strong, dedicated scientists must accept. By 1941, the experimental apparatus is ready. The camps exist. The doctors are in place. The ideological framework has been established. The administrative systems for requisitioning subjects and processing results are operational. The medical profession has been taught for over a decade that some lives matter less than others, that service to the state supersedes traditional medical ethics, that difficult choices must be made for the greater good. All that's missing is the decision to begin, and here's what the records show very clearly. Nobody had to order it. The experiments began because doctors proposed them, because opportunities existed, because career advancement depended on producing results, because the system rewarded initiative in serving the regime's goals. The machinery of horror didn't require a dictator commanding every action. It required only that ethical boundaries be systematically dismantled, that the medical profession be reshaped to serve ideology, that ambitious men be given opportunities and resources, and that millions of people be declared subhuman and therefore available for any use. The first documented experiments at Dachau begin in 1941, but scattered evidence suggests earlier studies, preliminary work, development of methods in places and times, less thoroughly documented. The official story has a clear beginning point. The truth, as always, is messier, a gradual descent into darkness where the exact moment ethics died is impossible to pinpoint. There's a photograph that surfaced in 2011. It shows a group of men in white coats standing outside a building. The photo is dated 1939 based on uniform details and architectural features in the background. The building was identified through exhaustive research as a facility in occupied Poland that officially didn't begin operating until 1941. The men are smiling. Professional, confident, one holds what appears to be a medical instrument. Another has his hand on the shoulder of a colleague, the gesture of easy camaraderie. They look exactly like doctors, anywhere, anytime professionals at their workplace, caught in a casual moment between duties. The photograph offers no evidence of crimes, no smoking gun, just doctors at a facility, 2 years before that facility officially existed according to the historical record. Here's what we know for certain. By 1941, systematic human experimentation was occurring across multiple concentration camps. Here's what we suspect but cannot prove, that the groundwork was laid earlier, in places less documented, through processes that left fewer traces. The gap between what we know and what we suspect is where the shadows lie, and in those shadows, questions multiply. How many facilities were there? How many doctors participated? When exactly did this begin? What experiments occurred before the ones we know about? Where are the missing records? What did they contain? Who destroyed them? What are they hiding? The comfortable version of history has clear beginnings and endings, heroes and villains, documented facts forming complete narratives. The reality is fragmented documents, missing files, unanswered questions, and the disturbing knowledge that what we've discovered may be only a portion of what actually occurred. They didn't document everything. Much was intentionally destroyed. More was lost to time and war. What remains is enough to horrify. What's missing may be worse. The nightmare was born in defeat, in humiliation, in the toxic combination of wounded national pride and pseudo-scientific racial theory. It grew through incremental ethical compromises, through career ambitions, through the systematic teaching of cruelty as virtue. By the time the concentration camps became operational, the transformation was complete. Medicine had become torture. Science had become murder, and men who'd sworn oaths to heal were ready to become architects of systematic atrocity. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The curtain was rising on horrors that would make the previous decade's preparations seem almost benign by comparison. What the records don't tell us, what we may never fully know, is how many other stages existed before this one. How many rehearsals occurred before the main performance? How many victims died in experiments that left no trace because someone, somewhere, made sure they wouldn't? The memo was typed on standard Wehrmacht letterhead, dated March 15, 1942. 3 lines, bureaucratically precise. Request approved for installation of low-pressure chamber at Dachau facility. Equipment to be requisitioned from Luftwaffe medical research stores. Subject allocation. Minimum 50 prisoners. expandable upon demonstration of research value. It was filed in a routine supply request folder, discovered during an archive audit in 1997. No drama, no evidence of evil intent, just an administrator approving equipment transfer for what the paperwork describes as aviation medicine research. The low-pressure chamber arrived by military transport 2 weeks later. Installation took 5 days. Testing of equipment, 3 days. Then, on a morning in early April 1942, the first prisoner was strapped into the chamber. His name, if it was ever recorded, hasn't survived. His death, documented in clinical language as subject expired at simulated altitude of 21,000 meters, earned exactly 3 lines in Dr. Sigmund Rascher's research notes. By the end of that month, 17 men were dead. By June, the number had reached 63. By the time the experiments officially concluded in May 1943, over 200 prisoners had died in that chamber, their final moments recorded in graphs and charts measuring oxygen deprivation, blood pressure changes, the precise second when consciousness faded and death approached. Here's what disturbs historians most about this documentation. It's completely normal. It reads like any other scientific research record: observations, measurements, conclusions. The only difference is that the research materials were human beings, and the experiment's endpoint was their death. Dachau opened on March 22, 1933, less than 2 months after Hitler became Chancellor. It was Germany's first concentration camp, initially designed to hold political prisoners, communists, and other enemies of the Nazi state. Over 12 years of operation, more than 200,000 prisoners would pass through its gates. Over 40,000 would die there. But Dachau's significance extends beyond its role as a prison. It became the prototype, the model that later camps would follow. And crucially, it became the SS's primary medical research facility, the place where doctors could pursue questions that ethics normally prevented them from asking. The camp is located just outside Munich, close enough to the city that university doctors could easily commute, close enough that academic institutions could maintain connections to the research being conducted behind the wire, far enough that Munich's citizens could claim ignorance of what happened there, though the smoke from the crematorium was visible on clear days, and everyone knew what Dachau was. The transformation from prison camp to research facility occurred gradually. Initially, the camp doctor's role was limited, treating guards, handling disease outbreaks among prisoners, performing selections to determine who was fit for labor. Standard, if grim, medical work within a brutal system. The shift happened in 1941. The Luftwaffe had problems that needed solving. Pilots were flying higher than ever before, altitudes where oxygen became scarce, where pressure changes caused painful and sometimes fatal symptoms. When planes were shot down over the North Atlantic, pilots who survived the crash often died from hypothermia before rescue arrived. The Navy faced similar questions. How long could sailors survive in frigid water? These were genuine tactical problems. Solving them could save German lives. Traditional medical research would study accident victims, conduct careful observational studies, use animal testing to explore basic physiology. That takes time, resources, and it might not provide the specific, actionable data military commanders wanted. But at Dachau, there was another option. Test subjects were available, unlimited numbers of them, prisoners who had no rights, whose deaths would be recorded but not mourned, whose suffering could be measured with scientific precision. The decision to begin experiments wasn't made in a dramatic meeting or signed in a secret order. It emerged from conversations between Luftwaffe medical officers and SS doctors, from research proposals submitted through proper channels, from budget approvals that allocated funding for aviation medicine research utilizing available subject populations. Dr. Sigmund Rascher submitted his proposal in May 1941, professional, detailed, scientifically structured. He wanted to study high-altitude physiology using live subjects rather than animals. His justification was compelling. Animal physiology differs from human in crucial ways. To truly understand how pilots' bodies responded to extreme altitude, you needed human test subjects, and at Dachau, such subjects were available. The proposal was approved, equipment was ordered, a research facility was established in the camp's medical block, and on a date the records don't precisely specify, sometime in late 1941 or early 1942, the first prisoner was locked in a pressure chamber, and the first experiment began. What followed is documented in gruesome detail. Russia kept meticulous notes. Prisoners were strapped into the low-pressure chamber, unable to move, unable to escape. The pressure was gradually reduced, simulating ascent to higher and higher altitudes. At around 15,000 feet, symptoms began: headache, nausea, confusion. At 20,000 feet, severe oxygen deprivation, potential loss of consciousness. Above 25,000 feet, rapid deterioration toward death. The experiments tested various scenarios: rapid decompression, simulating a plane losing pressure at altitude; slow descent to see if gradual acclimatization helped; different oxygen supplement levels, attempts to revive subjects after consciousness was lost. The variables changed, but the outcome was often the same. The prisoner died, and his death was recorded as data. Russia's reports described these deaths in clinical language. Subject became restless at simulated altitude of 12,000 meters. At 14,000 meters, subject began experiencing severe respiratory distress. At 16,000 meters, consciousness was lost. Death occurred at 17,500 meters after approximately 6 minutes of oxygen deprivation. No names. No mention that the subject had screamed until his voice gave out, that he'd clawed at the chamber's sealed door, that his final moments were filled with terror as his lungs struggled for air that wasn't there. Just measurements, data, scientific observations. Some subjects survived the pressure chamber experiments. Their survival wasn't mercy, it was necessity. To understand the full range of human response to altitude, you needed subjects who lived as well as those who died. The survivors could be used again and again, until eventually they died too, or were selected for different experiments, or simply worked to death in the camp. But here's what the records show that's particularly chilling. Russia wasn't working in isolation. His research was overseen by senior Luftwaffe medical officers. His preliminary findings were presented at medical conferences. His requests for equipment and subjects went through proper bureaucratic channels. The experiments at Dachau weren't a rogue operation by a single sadistic doctor. They were officially sanctioned research, conducted with institutional approval, supported by multiple levels of military and medical authority. The low-pressure chamber was just the beginning. Russia's second major research program studied hypothermia specifically, how to revive severely chilled victims. Again, the justification was tactical. Downed pilots in the North Atlantic, sailors from torpedoed ships. The question was practical. What was the most effective rewarming method? The experiments began in August 1942. Prisoners were immersed in tanks of ice water, their body temperatures monitored as hypothermia set in. The water temperature was typically between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill, but slowly enough that the dying process could be measured and documented. Some prisoners were kept in the water for as long as 5 hours. The cold worked its way through their bodies systematically. First, violent shivering as the body tried to generate heat, then confusion and loss of coordination as core temperature dropped. Eventually, unconsciousness as the brain shut down. Death followed, unless the subject was removed and rewarming attempted. The rewarming experiments tested different methods: hot baths, heated blankets, internal warming through forcing the victim to drink hot liquids, and, in what Russia called rewarming by body contact, placing the frozen victim between naked women, using their body heat to raise his temperature. This last method deserves particular attention, not because it was more deadly than the others, though it was largely ineffective, but because it reveals the complete moral collapse of the research. The women forced to participate were prisoners themselves, coerced into becoming instruments of the experiment. The supposed scientific justification that this method simulated field conditions where crashed pilots might share body heat was transparently absurd, but it was recorded as legitimate research, written up in reports, defended as a practical question requiring empirical answers. At least 80 prisoners died in the hypothermia experiments. The exact number is uncertain because record-keeping was inconsistent, and because many subjects who survived the initial experiment died shortly afterward from complications, pneumonia, heart failure, permanent neurological damage from oxygen deprivation. The data Russia generated was largely useless. His experimental design was flawed, his controls inadequate, his measurements imprecise. The sadistic elements forcing subjects to endure maximum suffering, testing extreme conditions no pilot would actually face corrupted whatever scientific value the studies might have had. Later analysis by medical researchers concluded that his findings contributed essentially nothing to actual hypothermia treatment protocols. But that didn't matter. The experiments continued because they could, because Russia's career depended on producing results, because the system rewarded conducting experiments regardless of their actual value. While Russia was killing prisoners at Dachau, a parallel experimental empire was emerging at Auschwitz. The camp complex in occupied Poland would become the largest in the Nazi system, actually several camps. Auschwitz I, the original camp, Auschwitz II Birkenau, the massive death factory, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, the industrial slave labor site. Together, they held over 100,000 prisoners at peak capacity. Together, they would kill more than 1 million people, mostly Jews transported there for immediate extermination. But Auschwitz was more than a death factory. It was also the site of extensive medical experimentation, overseen by dozens of doctors, conducted on thousands of prisoners. And it was home to the most infamous Nazi doctor of all, Josef Mengele. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943. He was 32 years old, an experienced SS officer, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, and a trained physician with a doctorate in anthropology. His assignment was camp doctor, one of several physicians responsible for selections, for maintaining health among the prisoner population capable of work, and for conducting whatever research opportunities the camp presented. Here's what makes Mengele's story so disturbing. He wasn't assigned to conduct horrific experiments. He chose to. The opportunity was their unlimited subjects, complete freedom from ethical oversight, SS support for racial research, and he seized it enthusiastically. His obsession was twins. He believed that studying identical twins, subjecting them to identical treatments or deliberately different treatments, could unlock fundamental secrets of heredity. If you could understand how genes expressed themselves, he reasoned, you could manipulate them, you could engineer better humans. You could prove the biological basis of Aryan superiority. The science was nonsense. Genetics doesn't work the way Mengele imagined. His experimental designs wouldn't have yielded useful data, even if conducted ethically. But he had resources, authority, and hundreds of sets of twins transported to Auschwitz from across Nazi-occupied Europe. Survivors remember him on the selection ramp, tall, handsome, impeccably dressed in his SS uniform, whistling classical music while deciding fates with a gesture. Left, immediate death in the gas chambers. Right, temporary survival for labor. But when twins arrived, Mengele personally intervened. Zwillinge, he would call out. Twins. They were pulled from the lines, registered separately, given special barracks, provided better food rations. This special treatment wasn't mercy. It was preservation of research materials. The twins were valuable as experimental subjects. They needed to survive long enough to be studied. What happened in Mengele's laboratory at Auschwitz is documented through survivor testimony, through the few prisoners forced to assist him who lived to testify, through fragmentary records that escaped destruction. The picture that emerges is one of systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. Mengele injected chemicals into children's eyes, attempting to change brown eyes to blue, pursuing the Aryan ideal of eye color through methods that caused severe pain, infection, and sometimes blindness. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, deliberately inflicting injuries to study healing processes. He infected one twin with disease while keeping the control twin healthy, monitoring how illness progressed differently in genetically identical individuals. Most horrifically, He killed twins simultaneously, often by chloroform injection directly into the heart, so he could perform comparative autopsies. He wanted to examine organs, tissues, cellular structures while they were as fresh as possible, before decomposition began. The twins he killed this way were often children, young enough that they called him Uncle Mengele before he murdered them. The medical value of these experiments was zero. Nothing Mengele did at Auschwitz contributed any knowledge to genetics or medicine. His belief that twins held genetic secrets was based on misunderstanding of how heredity worked. His methods were so unscientific, so corrupted by ideology and sadism, that even if his theoretical framework had been sound, his results would have been worthless. But understanding that his experiments were scientifically valueless doesn't fully explain their horror. The deeper question is, why did he do it? Did he genuinely believe he was unlocking genetic secrets? Was he caught up in the ideology of creating superior humans? Or had the complete absence of ethical constraints, combined with unlimited power over prisoners' lives, simply revealed what he was capable of becoming? Survivors who knew him describe a paradox. He could be charming, even kind to selected prisoners, particularly children who served his research purposes. He personally ensured his twins received better treatment than other prisoners, enough food to keep them healthy, protection from random violence. Then he would inject them with typhus, or perform experimental surgery, or kill them for autopsy, all while maintaining the same charming demeanor. The capacity to be personally pleasant while conducting systematic atrocity suggests something more disturbing than simple sadism. A true sadist takes pleasure in causing pain. Mengele seemed largely indifferent to his subjects' suffering. It was neither the point nor a deterrent. They were materials for his research, no more significant than laboratory mice. Their pain was irrelevant. Their deaths were data points. Over 1,500 sets of twins were documented as entering Mengele's program at Auschwitz. Fewer than 200 individuals survived. The rest died in experiments, or were murdered for autopsies, or succumbed to the harsh camp conditions that even special treatment couldn't fully mitigate. While Mengele pursued his twisted genetic research, other doctors at Auschwitz conducted their own experimental programs. The camp's size and the constant influx of prisoners made it an ideal location for medical research requiring large numbers of subjects. Dr. Karl Klauberg established his sterilization research program in Block 10 at Auschwitz in April 1943, the same month Mengele arrived. His mandate from Himmler was explicit. Develop a method for rapid, inexpensive mass sterilization. If Germany conquered Eastern Europe permanently, millions of Slavic inhabitants would need to be rendered unable to reproduce, ensuring they couldn't eventually outnumber German settlers. Klauberg's method involved injecting caustic chemicals directly into women's uteruses and fallopian tubes. The substances, including formalin, acid, and silver nitrate, would cause inflammation and scarring, blocking the reproductive tract. The procedure could be performed in minutes, during what appeared to be a routine gynecological examination, perfect for mass application. The women who became his subjects endured excruciating pain. The injections caused severe cramping, internal burning, and often led to dangerous infections. Many died from complications. Those who survived faced permanent infertility and chronic pain. Klauberg kept meticulous records of his results, proudly reporting to Himmler that he could sterilize thousands of women daily using his technique. Here's what the records show. Klauberg wasn't a marginal figure conducting secret experiments. He was a recognized gynecologist with a successful pre-war practice, published research, professional reputation. He volunteered for the sterilization research program, seeing it as an opportunity for career advancement. The SS provided him with facilities, staff, and unlimited subjects. Universities knew of his work. Medical professionals visited his laboratory. His research was integrated into the broader SS medical research enterprise. Dr. Horst Schumann pursued sterilization through a different method, targeted X-ray radiation to reproductive organs. Men's testicles were exposed to high-dose radiation, causing severe burns and permanent sterility. Women's ovaries received similar treatment. The procedure was faster than Klauberg's chemical method, but more immediately damaging the radiation burns often became infected, causing sepsis and death. The cynical efficiency of having two doctors pursuing the same goal through different methods reveals the systematic nature of the research. The SS wanted options. If chemical sterilization proved impractical for mass application, perhaps radiation would work. If neither method succeeded, other doctors would try other approaches. The goal, rendering millions infertile, was fixed. The methods were simply technical problems to be solved. But Auschwitz wasn't the only location for medical experimentation. Across the concentration camp network, similar programs were underway. At Ravensbrück, the women's camp north of Berlin, Dr. Karl Gebhardt conducted surgical experiments on Polish political prisoners. Gebhardt was Himmler's personal physician and the highest-ranking SS medical officer. His experiments focused on treating battlefield wounds specifically, testing whether sulfonamide drugs could prevent infections in contaminated injuries. The experimental protocol was brutally direct. Deliberately wound prisoners, infect the wounds with bacteria, glass shards, or wood fragments, then test whether sulfur drugs could cure the resulting infections. 74 young Polish women underwent these experiments without anesthesia or consent. They were deliberately mutilated, their legs cut open and infected, then either left untreated as controls or given experimental treatments. Some women died from gangrene. Others survived with permanent disabilities, damaged muscles, amputated limbs, chronic pain. The survivors were secretly called rabbits by other prisoners because they hopped when they walked, unable to put weight on their mutilated legs. Here's a detail that provides context. After Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking SS official, was wounded in an assassination attempt in May 1942 and subsequently died of sepsis, questions arose about whether Gebhardt had treated him properly, specifically whether he should have used sulfur drugs more aggressively. Rather than accept criticism, Gebhardt designed experiments to prove his treatment had been appropriate, that sulfur drugs wouldn't have saved Heydrich. To prove this, he deliberately inflicted similar wounds on prisoners, deliberately infected them, and monitored whether the drugs helped. His experiments were motivated not by military necessity, but by career preservation. Dozens of women were mutilated to defend one doctor's professional reputation. The experiments at Ravensbrück, like those at Dachau and Auschwitz, were conducted openly within the SS medical system. Records were kept, reports were filed, findings were presented at conferences. Gebhardt wasn't hiding his work. He was proud of it, saw it as important research, expected professional recognition for his findings. At Buchenwald, prisoners were deliberately infected with epidemic diseases: typhus, yellow fever, smallpox, cholera diseases that could devastate armies in the field. The experiments tested vaccines, monitoring how different preparations protected against infection. The control group's prisoners given no vaccine or given placebo died in large numbers. The experimental groups fared somewhat better, though many died anyway from complications or from other conditions in the camp. At Sachsenhausen, prisoners were shot with poison-tipped bullets to test their effectiveness. At Natzweiler-Struthof in Alsace, they were exposed to chemical weapons. At Neuengamme, children were infected with tuberculosis to test vaccines. The pattern repeated across dozens of facilities. Wherever concentration camps existed, medical experiments followed. The camps provided what unethical research requires: subjects without rights, deaths without accountability, suffering without consequences for those causing it. But the camps alone couldn't create this system. They required institutional support, bureaucratic infrastructure, career incentives that rewarded participation. The pharmaceutical industry's involvement is documented but often overlooked. IG Farben, Germany's largest chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate, contracted directly with the SS for human drug testing. Letters survive in corporate archives, banal in their matter-of-fact brutality. We received your shipment of 150 women. Price acceptable. Condition of subjects upon arrival: satisfactory. We will contact you for another shipment. The women prisoners from Auschwitz were transported to IG Farben facilities for drug testing, new anesthetics, experimental vaccines, untested medications. They received no consent forms, no information about what was being done to them. Their reactions were recorded, side effects were documented. Deaths were noted in company ledgers alongside production costs and experimental protocols. Bayer, a subsidiary of IG Farben, tested experimental drugs at Auschwitz and other camps. Hoechst conducted pharmaceutical trials on prisoners. These weren't secret programs hidden from corporate leadership. They were official contracts, approved at high levels, integrated into normal business operations. After the war, IG Farben was broken up during denazification. The successor companies Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, and others became global pharmaceutical giants. Their Nazi-era conduct faded into corporate history, mentioned in footnotes if at all. Compensation for victims was minimal and delayed for decades. The corporate involvement reveals an uncomfortable truth. The experimental apparatus didn't rely solely on Nazi ideology or SS brutality. It was sustained by ordinary business incentives. Pharmaceutical companies wanted cost-effective drug testing. The camps provided it. Company executives made rational business decisions to contract for human testing, weighing costs against benefits, just as they would for any vendor relationship. The subject's humanity simply wasn't part of the calculation. The bureaucracy that managed this system was extensive and meticulous. The Reich Research Council coordinated medical research across Germany, allocating funding, setting priorities, ensuring experiments served military or ideological goals. Within the SS, the Hygiene Institute oversaw concentration camp medical programs. Doctors submitted research proposals through proper channels. Committees reviewed and approved them. Budgets were allocated based on perceived value. Equipment was requisitioned through supply systems. Subjects were allocated from camp populations based on experimental requirements. Weekly meetings distributed resources and shared findings. Successful experiments received additional funding. Doctors who produced results earned promotions. The system operated exactly like academic research administration anywhere, except the research materials were human beings and the experiments frequently ended in death. This bureaucratic normality is perhaps more disturbing than dramatic evil. The experiments weren't chaotic torture sessions conducted by obviously deranged madmen. They were systematic research programs, properly administered, carefully documented, conducted by credentialed professionals operating within institutional frameworks. Requisition forms survive. Request: 100 male subjects, ages 20 to 40, for nutritional deprivation study. Purpose: determining minimum caloric intake compatible with sustained labor capacity. The form was approved, the subjects were provided, the study was conducted, results were filed. No drama. No explicit acknowledgement that subjects were people being deliberately starved. The language throughout is clinical, bureaucratic. Subject expired during procedure. Specimen quality was suboptimal due to advanced deterioration. Additional material requested for continuation of studies. The euphemisms created, distance, allowed participants to avoid confronting what they were actually doing. By 1943, the experimental apparatus was fully operational. Tens of thousands of prisoners across dozens of camps were simultaneously involved in various research programs. The scale was unprecedented. Never before had human experimentation been conducted so systematically, on such a large scale, with such complete freedom from ethical constraints. The question historians grapple with is how this happened. Not just the ideology. We understand that Nazi racial theory dehumanized victims, making their suffering seem acceptable. Not just the war military necessity justified many crimes. The deeper question is how the institutions failed. How universities, medical schools, professional societies, pharmaceutical companies, and government health agencies all participated in or enabled systematic atrocity. Part of the answer lies in incrementalism. Each step was small enough to rationalize. First, teaching that some races were inferior, then forced sterilization of the genetically defective, then euthanasia of the severely disabled, then imprisonment of political enemies, then using prisoners for labor, then using prisoners for experiments. Each step built on the last. By the time the full horror was apparent, thousands of people were implicated, careers were invested, institutional momentum was unstoppable. But incrementalism alone doesn't fully explain it. Some doctors refused to participate and faced minimal consequences. Some institutions resisted and continued operating. The experiments happened because many people chose to participate, chose the career advancement, chose the research opportunities, chose to ignore ethical boundaries in pursuit of professional success. The experiments also happened because they could. The camps existed, the prisoners existed, the absence of oversight created opportunities, and the incentive structures, professional recognition for published research, career advancement for successful programs, funding for productive laboratories all rewarded participation while offering no penalties for moral refusal. There's a document discovered in Russian archives in 2009 that encapsulates the system's chilling banality. It's a memo from a camp administrator to a pharmaceutical company, dated September 1943. In response to your inquiry of August 12, current prisoner population can support testing cohort of approximately 500 subjects. Replacement capacity, 50 to 75 per week, dependent on transport schedules. Propose monthly allocation at previously agreed rates. Subjects meeting your specified criteria available for immediate delivery upon contract confirmation. 500 subjects. Replacement capacity of 50 to 75 per week. Previously agreed rates. The language could describe any supply chain management discussion. Widgets being delivered to factories. Raw materials being allocated to production facilities. Except the subjects were human beings. The replacement capacity meant how quickly people were arriving at the camp to replace those killed in experiments. The previously agreed rates were the price per human life that a pharmaceutical company paid the SS for access to prisoners. The memo has no dramatic language, no explicit acknowledgement of evil. It's just business correspondence, administrative efficiency, logistics management, which is somehow more disturbing than overt cruelty. The complete normalization of horror, rendered in the language of routine business operations. And here's what the records don't tell us. They document the experiments that succeeded in generating data, however worthless that data proved to be. They document the programs that achieved bureaucratic visibility, that were large enough or high-profile enough to leave extensive paper trails. What about the experiments that didn't work, that were abandoned before generating reports? What about the programs run by individual doctors pursuing personal theories without official sanction? What about the camps where record-keeping was poor, where prisoners died without documentation, where experiments occurred in the chaos of wartime without generating formal reports? Survivors describe experiments that match no documented programs, procedures they endured that appear in no known research protocols, doctors whose names don't appear in any administrative records. These accounts are harder to verify, they lack documentary support, they sometimes contradict each other, they emerge decades after events from traumatized memories, but they suggest the possibility, perhaps the probability, that what we know represents only the visible portion. The experiments conducted systematically enough to leave documentation, the programs large enough to require bureaucratic approval, the research high-profile enough that records survived destruction. Below that documented surface, how much more was there? How many prisoners died in experiments that left no trace? How many doctors conducted informal studies that never appeared in any report? The archives can't answer these questions. The gaps in documentation become their own evidence, evidence that suggests the full scope of horror exceeded what can be definitively proven. As 1944 began, the experimental empire was at its peak. Thousands of prisoners serving as subjects, dozens of doctors conducting programs, multiple facilities operating simultaneously. The system functioned with bureaucratic efficiency, generating reports, allocating resources, producing results that advanced careers even when they advanced nothing else. But the war was turning. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Allied forces were preparing for invasion in the west. The 1,000-year Reich that was supposed to last forever had perhaps 2 years remaining. And that meant hard questions were approaching. What would happen to the camps when they were liberated? What would happen to the evidence of what occurred there? What would happen to the doctors when their actions could no longer be hidden behind military security and Nazi power? Those questions would shape everything that followed. The desperate final months when perpetrators raced to destroy evidence while prisoners fought to preserve testimony. The liberation when Allied soldiers confronted horrors they'd barely imagined. The trials that attempted to deliver justice for crimes unprecedented in their systematic scale. The machinery of horror had been built with bureaucratic efficiency and professional participation across multiple institutions. What came next would test whether that machinery had produced anything beyond suffering, whether the thousands of deaths, the systematic torture, the complete abandonment of medical ethics, had achieved even the narrow tactical goals that supposedly justified them. The research proposal sat on a desk in Berlin for 3 weeks before anyone noticed it was missing a critical section. Dr. Rasche had submitted detailed protocols for his pressure chamber experiments, the variables he would test, the measurements he would take, the equipment he would need. What he hadn't included was any discussion of what would happen to subjects who survived. When a junior administrator finally pointed out the omission, Rasche's response was filed in the project folder. A single sentence, dated February 19, 1942. Survival is not an anticipated outcome of high-altitude studies beyond 18,000 meters. The proposal was approved without revision. Nobody questioned whether experiments designed to kill their subjects could legitimately be called medical research. The distinction between studying human limits and deliberately causing death had ceased to exist. But here's what makes that response particularly chilling. Rasche wasn't wrong. At extreme altitudes, death was virtually certain, which means every experiment at those altitudes wasn't testing whether subjects would survive, it was measuring how they would die. The research wasn't about saving pilots, it was about documenting the stages of death from oxygen deprivation, recorded with scientific precision while men suffocated in a sealed chamber. This wasn't medicine, it was systematic murder with a laboratory notebook. The altitude and pressure chamber experiments at Dachau ran from early 1942 through May 1943. Over 200 prisoners died. The deaths were categorized in Rasche's reports by altitude level, duration of oxygen deprivation, and physiological response during terminal phases. Subjects were typically strapped into the chamber in groups of 3 or 4. The pressure would drop gradually, simulating ascent. At lower altitudes, 10 to 12,000 meters, some subjects survived, though often with permanent neurological damage from oxygen deprivation. At higher altitudes, survival became impossible. The experiments simply measured how long death took and what symptoms appeared along the way. Some experiments tested rapid decompression, simulating catastrophic pressure loss at high altitude. Prisoners were exposed to sudden pressure drops, equivalent to being instantly transported from ground level to 65,000 feet. The results were uniformly fatal. Lungs ruptured, blood vessels in the brain hemorrhaged. Death came within minutes, sometimes seconds. Rasche documented these deaths with clinical detachment. Subject 3 exhibited pulmonary hemorrhage at T plus 43 seconds, loss of consciousness at T plus 55 seconds, cardiac arrest at T plus 2 minutes 17 seconds. No acknowledgement that Subject 3 was a human being who died in agony while doctors watched through a viewing port. The stated purpose was improving pilot survival at high altitude. The actual result was a collection of death studies that contributed nothing to aviation safety. Experienced aviation medicine specialists examining Rasche's data after the war concluded it was scientifically worthless, poorly controlled, contaminated by variables, measuring phenomena that bore little resemblance to actual pilot experiences. But the experiments continued for over a year. Why? Because they could. Because Rasche's career depended on producing results. Because the Luftwaffe Medical Corps wanted data, even useless data, to justify their research programs. Because prisoners were available, and their deaths were consequence-free for the doctors conducting the studies. The hypothermia experiments followed a similar pattern. Prisoners were immersed in ice water. their body temperatures monitored as hypothermia progressed. Water temperature ranged from 2 to 12 degrees Celsius. Immersion times varied from 1 to 5 hours. The stated goal was determining optimal rescue protocols for downed pilots in cold water. But here's where the research diverged completely from any legitimate medical inquiry. Russia wasn't studying accident victims or conducting controlled experiments with volunteers who could withdraw at any time. He was forcing prisoners to endure conditions no rescue scenario would actually present, measuring their suffering with instruments while they slowly froze to death. The rewarming studies added another layer of cruelty disguised as science. After subjects reached near-fatal hypothermia, core body temperatures below 28 degrees Celsius, Russia tested various revival methods. Hot baths sometimes caused fatal shock, as blood vessels dilated too rapidly. Heated blankets worked slowly, giving time for complications to develop. Internal warming through hot fluids provided mixed results. Then there was rewarming by body contact, forcing naked women to lie with frozen, often unconscious men. Russia's reports describe this method in pseudo-scientific language. Human rewarming through direct thermal contact demonstrates comparable efficacy to mechanical warming methods while requiring minimal equipment. The subtext that this procedure involved coercing women prisoners into becoming instruments of torture goes unmentioned in the clinical documentation. At least 80 prisoners died in the hypothermia experiments. Many more survived with permanent damage, amputated limbs from frostbite, neurological impairment from oxygen deprivation, psychological trauma from watching others die beside them in the water tanks. The data generated was contradictory and unreliable. Russia's methods were so flawed that his findings often contradicted basic medical knowledge. Yet his research was presented at medical conferences, published in abbreviated form, cited by other researchers. The veneer of scientific legitimacy persisted despite the complete absence of scientific value. While Russia was documenting death at Dachau, pharmaceutical experiments were spreading across the concentration camp network. The Wehrmacht distributed methamphetamine, marketed as Pervitin, to millions of soldiers throughout the war. But standard military doses were just the beginning. At Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and other facilities, doctors tested higher doses, stronger formulations, combinations with other stimulants. The military wanted soldiers who never tired, never felt pain, never questioned orders. Chemistry seemed to offer answers. Methamphetamine kept users awake for days, suppressed appetite, created feelings of invincibility, perfect for the modern battlefield. Prisoners received massive doses and were forced to march until collapse. How far can a man walk on methamphetamine before his heart explodes? How many days without sleep before psychosis renders a soldier useless? The experiments produced both results and corpses. Some subjects developed permanent psychosis. Others suffered heart attacks or strokes. But the Wehrmacht got its data, and Pervitin continued flowing to frontline troops, millions of men fighting while chemically enhanced, their nervous systems burning out in service of conquest. Here's what the pharmaceutical experiments reveal that other programs don't. The Nazi medical establishment wasn't just pursuing ideological goals or satisfying sadistic impulses. They were conducting market research, testing products, optimizing dosages. The concentration camps functioned as clinical trial sites for drugs that would be distributed to millions. And it worked, not in the sense of creating super soldiers, but in the narrower sense of producing actionable data about drug effects at extreme doses. The experiments were unethical, cruel, scientifically compromised by poor methodology. But they generated information that pharmaceutical companies and military medical corps actually used. This creates a disturbing question that persists into the present. When unethical research produces useful results, what do we do with that knowledge? Can it ever be ethically applied? Or does using it validate the atrocities that produced it? The pain threshold experiments pursued a darker fantasy. At multiple camps, doctors inflicted escalating torture while measuring subjects' physiological responses. Electric shocks, burns, bone breaking. The research question was simple. Can tolerance to pain be increased through conditioning? Can men be trained to endure interrogation without breaking? The experiments revealed nothing useful about enhancing soldiers, but much about sadism dressed in clinical language. Subjects didn't develop increased pain tolerance, they simply experienced escalating trauma until they died or lost consciousness. The research amounted to systematic torture with measurement instruments attached, but the documentation persists. Reports describing how long subjects remained conscious under various forms of torture, charts measuring heart rate and blood pressure during inflicted suffering, graphs correlating pain intensity with time until psychological breakdown. This documentation raises troubling questions about what happened to it after the war. Most reports from pain threshold experiments were supposedly destroyed. But were all of them? Intelligence agencies from multiple nations had access to captured Nazi medical research. Some materials were classified and remain so. What happened to the pain research? Was it simply destroyed as having no intelligence value? Or was it preserved, studied, potentially applied in enhanced interrogation programs? The official story is that such research was too tainted, too obviously worthless to preserve. The gaps in declassified intelligence files suggest a different possibility, that some research was considered too sensitive to release, not because it revealed nothing, but because it might reveal what was done with Nazi torture data in subsequent decades. The surgical enhancement program represented pure Nazi mythology. Himmler believed ancient Germanic warriors possessed special abilities, enhanced night vision, superior strength, extraordinary endurance. His doctors were tasked with recovering these abilities through surgery and genetic manipulation. Prisoners underwent experimental operations intended to strengthen bones, enhance sensory perception, increase lung capacity. Most died from infections or surgical complications. The few survivors showed no enhancements. The procedures were based on racial fantasy rather than medical reality. Yet the programs continued. Doctors performed unnecessary surgeries, tested unproven techniques, pursued theoretical modifications that had no basis in science. Why? Because Himmler wanted results, and doctors wanted career advancement. The gap between what ideology promised and what biology permitted was bridged not by admitting error, but by continuing experiments and adjusting the documentation to claim success. Reports from the surgical enhancement program read like science fiction. Subject demonstrates increased bone density following calcium compound injections. Enhanced low-light vision observed after retinal modification procedure. The claims were fabricated or exaggerated, beyond recognition, but they satisfied supervisors and justified continued funding. This reveals something crucial about the experimental system. Results mattered less than the appearance of productivity. Doctors who conducted experiments even failed. Pointless experiments advanced their careers. Doctors who questioned the scientific basis of programs or refused participation faced professional stagnation. The system rewarded activity over accuracy, participation over principle. At Auschwitz, Mengelé's twin experiments followed their own logic, or rather, their own lack of logic disguised as systematic inquiry. He believed that studying identical twins could reveal genetic secrets. The belief was groundless, but it drove him to collect over 1,500 sets of twins and subject them to experiments that ranged from painful to lethal. Mengele injected dyes into children's eyes, attempting to change brown to blue. The injections caused severe pain, inflammation, sometimes blindness. No eye color changes occurred. Melanin production is determined by genetic factors that can't be altered by injecting chemicals. But Mengele continued the experiments, documenting failures as if accumulated negative results might eventually yield positive outcomes. He performed surgeries connecting blood vessels between twins, trying to create artificial conjoined siblings. The operations had no scientific justification. He seemed to believe that physically linking twins might reveal something about their genetic connection. The surgeries caused infections, organ failures, deaths. Nothing was revealed except that Mengele had complete freedom to pursue whatever experiments his twisted imagination conceived. He infected one twin with disease while keeping the control twin healthy, monitoring how illness progressed differently in genetically identical individuals. This might seem like it had research value comparing disease progression in genetic twins, But Mengelé's methodology was so poor, his documentation so incomplete, his theoretical framework so flawed, that the experiments generated no useful data. They simply killed children while producing notes that satisfied Mengelé's supervisors that he was conducting important research. The most horrific aspect was the simultaneous killing of twins for comparative autopsies. Mengele would inject chloroform directly into twins' hearts, killing them at the same moment so he could examine their organs before decomposition. He believed this would reveal genetic differences at the cellular level. It revealed nothing. Identical twins have identical genetics, a fact that performing autopsies couldn't change. But it gave him fresh tissue samples and data to report. Over 1,500 sets of twins entered his program. Fewer than 200 individuals survived. The rest died in experiments, or were murdered for autopsies, or succumbed to camp conditions. Their deaths contributed zero knowledge to genetics, medicine, or science. They died because one doctor had unlimited power, zero oversight, and a fundamentally flawed understanding of how heredity works. Karl Clauberg's sterilization experiments at Auschwitz followed more practical goals with equally brutal methods. His mandate was developing rapid, inexpensive mass sterilization. The technique needed to work quickly enough for industrial-scale application while being disguised as routine medical examination. Clauberg injected caustic chemicals into women's reproductive tracts, formalin, acid, silver nitrate substances that caused inflammation and scarring, permanently blocking fertility. The procedure took minutes. It caused excruciating pain. It frequently led to fatal infections. But it worked, in the narrow technical sense. Women who survived the procedure were rendered infertile. Clauberg reported success to Himmler, claiming he could sterilize thousands daily using his method. The procedure was fast, required minimal equipment, could be performed by medical personnel with basic training. Here's what makes Clauberg's research particularly disturbing. It actually achieved its stated goal. Unlike most Nazi experiments, which failed to produce any useful results, Clauberg developed a procedure that did exactly what he promised: rapid, covert sterilization. The method was horrifically unethical, caused tremendous suffering, killed many subjects, but it worked. This technical success raises uncomfortable questions. After the war, Clauberg was captured, tried, imprisoned. But his technique, the basic method of chemical sterilization through caustic injections, was that knowledge truly erased? Or did it persist in medical literature, perhaps adapted for legitimate contraceptive research, its origins obscured or deliberately forgotten? Medical historians studying contraceptive history note gaps in the documentation of certain chemical sterilization research in the 1950s and 60s. Some techniques appeared with incomplete provenance, the theoretical basis well established but the experimental origins unclear. Were these independent developments, or were researchers building on Nazi experiments while carefully avoiding citation? Horst Schumann pursued sterilization through X-ray radiation. High-dose radiation focused on reproductive organs caused permanent sterility. The method was faster than Clauberg's chemical approach but more immediately harmful. Radiation burns often became infected, leading to sepsis and death. Schumann's experiments at Auschwitz tested various radiation doses and exposure times. Too little radiation failed to sterilize. Too much caused severe burns and rapid death. He sought the middle ground: enough radiation for permanent sterilization without causing immediate fatal injury. The experiments killed hundreds while achieving mixed technical results. Some subjects were successfully sterilized without immediate death, though many died later from radiation-related complications. Others survived with severe burns and chronic health problems. The method proved less practical than Clauberg's chemical approach, but Schumann continued testing, documenting outcomes, refining his technique. Both doctors, Clauberg and Schumann, were pursuing the same goal through different methods. The competitive element reveals how the experimental system functioned. Multiple researchers working on parallel projects, competing for resources and recognition, each trying to prove their approach superior. Normal scientific competition, except the competitors were racing to perfect methods for mass sterilization through human experimentation. At Ravensbrück, Karl Gebhardt's surgical experiments served an even more cynical purpose. After Reinhard Heydrich died from infected wounds in June 1942, questions arose about Gebhardt's treatment. Should he have used sulfur drugs more aggressively? Might different treatment have saved Heydrich? Rather than accept professional criticism, Gebhardt designed experiments to vindicate his decisions. He deliberately inflicted wounds on prisoners, infected them with bacteria, then tested whether sulfur drugs helped. If the drugs proved ineffective in his experiments, that would demonstrate he'd been right not to use them on Heydrich. 74 young Polish women underwent these experiments. Their legs were cut open, deliberately infected with bacteria, glass, and wood fragments. Some received sulfur drugs, others didn't, serving as controls. Gebhardt monitored which women died, which developed gangrene, which recovered. The experiments proved nothing about Heydrich's treatment. The conditions were too different, the variables too numerous, but they provided Gebhardt with data he could cite in his defense. They also mutilated dozens of women, killing some and leaving others permanently disabled, all to protect one doctor's professional reputation. The surviving rabbits women who could barely walk after their legs were mutilated later testified at war crimes trials. Their testimony was crucial in convicting Gebhardt, but it also revealed something horrifying. He'd conducted the experiments openly, with full administrative support, presenting findings at medical conferences. His colleagues knew what he was doing. Many viewed it as legitimate research rather than recognizing it as systematic torture motivated by professional vanity. At Buchenwald, the disease experiments followed yet another pattern. Prisoners were deliberately infected with epidemic diseases, typhus, yellow fever, smallpox, cholera. The stated purpose was testing vaccines for troops deployed in tropical regions. Some experiments had genuine military applications. German forces fighting in North Africa or occupied territories faced disease threats. Effective vaccines could save lives, but the method deliberately infecting prisoners, withholding treatment from control groups, observing disease progression until death transformed potentially legitimate research into systematic murder. Control groups were particularly cynical. To test vaccine effectiveness, you need subjects who develop the disease. So prisoners were infected and given no treatment, monitored as they sickened and died, their symptoms recorded for comparison against vaccinated groups. The experimental design required their deaths. They were killed to provide data points. Hundreds died this way. Their deaths were documented in charts comparing disease progression between vaccinated and unvaccinated subjects. The graphs showed vaccine efficacy. Clearly vaccinated prisoners had lower mortality rates, but the graph's baseline was corpses. Every data point in the control group represented a person who died because doctors deliberately infected them and withheld treatment. Some experiments had no military justification at all. Doctors infected prisoners with diseases they wanted to study, pursuing research interests rather than tactical objectives. The concentration camp system provided opportunity. Curious doctors pursued questions they found interesting. Prisoners died answering those questions. The poison experiments at Sachsenhausen tested various toxins on prisoners: cyanide in food, poison-tipped bullets, toxic gas exposure. The purpose was partly offensive weapons research, developing poison bullets that would kill even with non-fatal hits. Partly it was developing treatments for poisoning, in case Allies used similar weapons. But the experiments also served another function, providing convenient excuses for murder. Prisoners could be killed through experiments rather than execution, their deaths recorded as research casualties rather than deliberate killings. The veneer of scientific purpose disguised straightforward murder. This reveals a darker reality about the experimental programs. Some genuinely pursued research goals, however twisted the methods. Others were simply murder dressed in laboratory coats. The distinction blurred because the system treated both the same documenting deaths as experimental outcomes, processing bodies through the same administrative channels, filing reports through the same bureaucratic structures. Guards could kill prisoners and call it experimentation. Doctors could pursue personal vendettas through research protocols. Administrators could dispose of troublesome prisoners through transfer to experimental programs. The system provided cover for any cruelty that could be framed as serving research purposes. Through all these programs, a pattern emerges. Genuine military questions used to justify unlimited cruelty. The experiments were poorly designed, lacking control groups, standardized protocols, or peer review. The racial ideology constantly warped methodology. Researchers couldn't accept results contradicting Aryan superiority, so they manipulated data or dismissed findings. Most experiments yielded no useful knowledge, but they continued anyway because the system rewarded activity over results, because career advancement depended on conducting experiments, and because the subjects were considered subhuman and expendable. But here's what disturbs historians examining the evidence decades later. Some experiments did produce results. Not most, not the majority, but some. The pharmaceutical testing generated data about drug effects at extreme doses. The hypothermia studies, despite terrible methodology, occasionally produced observations about cold water, survival. The disease experiments tested vaccine efficacy, however unethically. This creates an impossible ethical dilemma. The research was conducted through murder. The data came from torture. But some of that data describes real physiological phenomena. Some findings might save lives if applied. Can knowledge gained through evil ever be used for good? Does refusing to use it honor the victims? Or does using it at least give their suffering some meaning? Medical ethicists have debated this question for decades without reaching consensus. The comfortable position is that Nazi data should never be used, that doing so validates torture and encourages future unethical research. But what if that data could save lives? What if refusing to use it means people die from ignorance that could be remedied? The debate intensified in 1984 when researcher Robert Pozos proposed using Nazi hypothermia data for cold water survival research. The proposal ignited fierce controversy. Survivors and ethicists argued that using the data dishonored victims. Scientists countered that refusing to use data that might save lives compounded the tragedy. No resolution was reached. The debate continues. And beneath the ethical arguments lies a disturbing question. Has the data already been used quietly, without public acknowledgement? Have military researchers referenced Nazi experiments in classified studies? Have pharmaceutical companies built on concentration camp drug trials while obscuring the origins of their knowledge? The gaps in declassified records suggest possibilities we cannot prove. The official story is that Nazi medical research was too tainted, too worthless to preserve. But intelligence agencies collected vast amounts of captured German research. Much remains classified. What was preserved? What was studied? What conclusions did Cold War researchers draw from Nazi experiments? By mid-1944, tens of thousands had died in experiments, across Nazi-controlled territory. The programs represented perhaps the most systematic betrayal of medical ethics in human history. Physicians transforming their knowledge of human vulnerability into instruments of torture, but the war's trajectory was shifting. Soviet armies were crushing German forces in the east. D-Day had opened a second front in France. The experimental empire, built to last 1,000 years, had perhaps a year remaining before collapse. The question facing perpetrators became urgent. What happens when the camps are liberated? What happens to the evidence? What happens to us? The answer would shape the final phase: desperate destruction of evidence, racing against prisoners fighting to preserve testimony. Liberation, bringing Allied soldiers face to face with horrors beyond imagination, and trials attempting to deliver justice for crimes unprecedented in their systematic scale. But before liberation came one final test. The experiments had been conducted with the promise that they would create super soldiers, unlock genetic secrets, provide tactical advantages worth the moral compromise. Now, as Germany faced military defeat, came the moment of truth. Did any of it actually work? Did the thousands of deaths, the systematic torture, the complete abandonment of medical ethics produce anything beyond suffering? The answer, documented in military records and battlefield reports, would prove both predictable and deeply troubling. Some programs did influence military operations. Some experiments did provide marginal tactical advantages, which raises perhaps the most disturbing question. If evil produces results, does that make resistance to evil more difficult? If atrocity sometimes works, how do we argue it should never be attempted? The official history provides comfortable answers. The unofficial history, the one buried in classified files and gap-filled archives, suggests questions we may not want to ask, let alone answer. The invasion of France began on May 10, 1940. German armoured columns crossed into Belgium and Luxembourg at dawn, pushing toward the Meuse River and the weak point in Allied defences. The plan was audacious: drive through the Ardennes forest, break through at Sedan, race to the Channel coast, trapping Allied armies in Belgium. The plan required speed, constant movement, soldiers advancing day and night without rest. The Wehrmacht had a chemical solution to the problem of human fatigue. Between April and July 1940, German military pharmacies distributed 35 million Pervitin tablets to Army and Air Force units, methamphetamine. Soldiers took the pills and kept moving. Tank crews drove for 72 hours straight. Infantry marched until their boots wore through, then marched further. The French and British couldn't match this tempo. Their troops, fighting conventionally, needed sleep after a day of combat. German soldiers, chemically enhanced, didn't stop. France fell in 6 weeks. The victory was attributed to superior tactics, better training, innovative armoured warfare doctrine. All true. But there was another factor, one less discussed in official histories. The German army that conquered France was fighting on methamphetamine. Here's where the human experiments at Dachau and Sachsenhausen become relevant. The dosing protocols for Pervitin weren't developed through careful clinical trials with volunteer subjects. They came from concentration camp experiments testing maximum doses, optimal timing, combinations with other stimulants. Prisoners who survived extreme doses provided data on lethal limits. Dead prisoners revealed cardiovascular damage patterns. The testing was ruthless and unscientific, but it generated practical knowledge about pushing human bodies beyond normal endurance through chemistry. The question that haunts military historians: did the experiments contribute to German victory in France? The uncomfortable answer is probably. Not decisively. German tactical innovations mattered more, but the chemical edge played a role. Soldiers stayed alert longer. Commanders could maintain operational tempo that exhausted their enemies. The methamphetamine didn't win the campaign, but it helped. And if it helped, does that validate the experiments? Does tactical advantage justify the torture that produced it? The question has no good answer, which is precisely why it keeps getting asked. The pharmaceutical enhancement proved devastatingly effective in the short term. Soldiers felt invincible, tireless, fearless. They could fight through injuries that would normally incapacitate. They could march distances that should have been impossible. The immediate tactical advantages were undeniable, but consequences emerged quickly. Soldiers on extended methamphetamine use developed psychosis, paranoia, heart problems. Many became addicted, requiring escalating doses to function. By 1941, military doctors were reporting widespread dependency among troops. The Eastern Front's brutal conditions amplified the problem. Soldiers took Pervitin to survive Russian winters, to stay alert during long night watches, to suppress fear during combat. Medical reports from 1942 describe units where majority of soldiers showed signs of stimulant dependency. Tremors, insomnia, irrational aggression, cardiovascular problems. Some soldiers died from heart attacks not caused by combat but by their own overstressed nervous systems. Others experienced psychotic breaks, had to be evacuated from frontline service. The Wehrmacht faced a dilemma: stop distributing Pervitin and lose the tactical advantage of chemically enhanced soldiers, continue distribution and watch addiction devastate units. They chose continuation. The short-term tactical benefits outweighed long-term health consequences. Soldiers were expendable. Their nervous systems could burn out in service of conquest. This calculation, trading long-term health for immediate combat effectiveness, was informed by the concentration camp experiments. Doctors knew from testing on prisoners roughly how long soldiers could maintain enhanced performance before dependency became incapacitating. They knew what doses produced optimal results versus doses that caused rapid deterioration. The experiments provided ugly practical knowledge that shaped military pharmaceutical policy. The U-boat service adapted pharmaceutical enhancement for underwater warfare. Submarine crews faced unique challenges: weeks submerged in cramped spaces, constant danger, exhausting watch rotations. Navy doctors developed experimental drug cocktails, combining methamphetamine with other stimulants, testing which formulations kept crews alert longest without inducing psychosis. The testing occurred at Neuengamme concentration camp, where prisoners received various drug combinations before being subjected to pressure chamber tests simulating dive depths. The survivors provided data on which combinations maintained cognitive function under stress. The dead revealed which formulations caused fatal cardiovascular strain. The data flowed to submarine command. Some U-boat commanders reported improved crew performance: sailors maintaining alertness through marathon patrols, sustaining fighting effectiveness longer than Allied crews. But costs emerged. Accidents increased as judgment deteriorated. Paranoia spread through confined spaces, not ideal when you're sealed in a metal tube underwater with armed shipmates. Addicted crewmen struggled during port leave, their behavior attracting unwanted attention. The program continued because short-term gains outweighed long-term problems. U-boat casualties from Allied attacks were so high that most crews died before addiction's full consequences appeared. The calculus was grim but mathematically sound. Enhance crew performance chemically, accept addiction, psychological damage as acceptable costs. Replace dead crews before long-term health effects matter. Here's a detail that emerged from declassified naval archives in 2004. The U-boat pharmaceutical program continued into 1944, long after its ineffectiveness became apparent. Why? Because cancelling it would mean admitting the concentration camp experiments that developed it had been pointless. Better to continue a failing program than acknowledge the prisoners died for nothing. The SS elite units received special treatment, experimental drug regimens, intensive training, psychological conditioning, emphasizing Aryan superiority and invincibility. Some units underwent surgical procedures intended to enhance night vision or pain tolerance. The results were mixed at best. Waffen-SS divisions fought with fanatical determination on multiple fronts, but this owed more to ideological commitment and tactical training than experimental enhancement. Units subjected to experimental procedures showed no measurable combat advantage. The surgical modifications frequently caused complications without improving performance. The psychological conditioning created determination but also inflexibility. SS units often fought to annihilation rather than retreating a tactical liability, despite propaganda value. Commanders found them useful for desperate situations requiring troops willing to die rather than surrender, but less useful for mobile warfare requiring tactical flexibility. But here's what's interesting about SS combat performance. It varied dramatically between units, and the variation doesn't correlate with enhancement programs. Some divisions that received no experimental treatments fought extremely effectively. Others that underwent extensive conditioning performed poorly. The human factors, leadership, training, unit cohesion, mattered far more than chemical or surgical enhancement. This suggests that most supersoldier programs were failures even by their own narrow metrics. They didn't create superior troops. They created troops with medical complications, psychological problems, and no measurable combat advantage. The experiments killed thousands to achieve nothing. Yet the programs continued. Why? Partly because admitting failure meant admitting the experiments were pointless murder. Partly because the bureaucratic machinery, once established, was hard to stop. Partly because doctors' careers depended on producing results, so they produced reports claiming success even when battlefield performance proved otherwise. On the Eastern Front, where warfare reached apocalyptic intensity, chemically enhanced German soldiers faced Soviet troops also using stimulants and vodka to survive impossible conditions. The clash became less a test of enhancement versus normal soldiers and more a mutual descent into chemically fueled brutality. Both sides lost hundreds of thousands to combat amplified by drugs reducing fear and pain. Soldiers fought until dead rather than until exhausted. Wounded men continued fighting through injuries that should have incapacitated them. The casualty rates on the Eastern Front exceeded anything seen in previous wars, partly because chemical enhancement allowed combat to continue past normal human breaking points. German military medical reports from the Eastern Front make disturbing reading. They describe units where soldiers took methamphetamine daily, not for tactical advantage but simply to endure the horror. They describe men fighting in -40-degree temperatures, sustained by drugs rather than proper winter equipment. They describe the psychological breakdown that came when drug supplies ran out and exhausted, traumatized soldiers suddenly felt everything they'd been chemically suppressing. The Eastern Front became a test of whether human enhancement through chemistry could overcome material disadvantage. Germany faced enemies with superior numbers, vast resources, and industrial capacity. Could chemically enhanced soldiers compensate? The answer was no. By Stalingrad in early 1943, the limits were clear. Methamphetamine couldn't replace food, winter clothing, ammunition, or reinforcements. Chemical enhancement provided marginal tactical advantages but couldn't overcome fundamental strategic weaknesses. The super soldier programs, having consumed thousands of lives in development, proved incapable of changing the war's trajectory. The Luftwaffe altitude program proved almost entirely useless in practical terms. Despite hundreds of deaths in pressure chamber experiments, German aircraft design and pilot training advanced little. The experiments were too poorly designed, too corrupted by ideology, to generate reliable data. Pilots flying at extreme altitude still suffered from oxygen deprivation and pressure-related injuries. The torture at Dachau produced no tactical advantage. Allied and German pilots faced similar physiological limits at high altitude because the experiments studying those limits were scientifically worthless. This complete failure raises questions about why the experiments continued for over a year. Russia's reports clearly showed he wasn't generating useful data. His experimental methods were criticized even within the SS medical establishment. Yet the program ran until May 1943, killing over 200 prisoners. The answer appears to be bureaucratic momentum. The program existed, had allocated resources, employed staff, generated reports. Cancelling it would require acknowledging failure. Easier to let it continue, filing reports that claimed progress while actual progress remained absent. The system rewarded activity, not results. Russia kept conducting experiments. Prisoners kept dying. No one with authority to stop it saw sufficient reason to intervene. The winter combat research from freezing experiments similarly failed to help. Despite Russia's extensive hypothermia testing, German troops froze to death by the thousands during Russian winters. The experiments revealed nothing that experienced military doctors didn't already know about cold exposure. The sadistic rewarming studies using women prisoners had no practical application. Survival guidelines distributed to troops could have been written without any human experimentation. The knowledge gained through torture simply confirmed common sense. People freeze to death in ice water. Warming them up helps if done before they die. Yet the experiments generated extensive documentation. Reports were filed, data was recorded, findings were presented at conferences. The appearance of scientific research persisted despite producing nothing useful. Here's what this reveals about the experimental system. It wasn't actually designed to advance knowledge. It was designed to appear to advance knowledge. The difference is crucial. A system designed for discovery would have cancelled failed programs, redirected resources to promising research, emphasized results over activity. The Nazi medical research system did none of these things. It rewarded conducting experiments, regardless of whether those experiments produced useful findings. Doctors advanced their careers by being active researchers, not successful researchers. Publishing papers mattered more than the paper's actual content. Conducting experiments demonstrated dedication to the regime's goals, even when the experiments failed completely. This explains why so many programs continued long after their failure became apparent. They weren't being evaluated on results. They were being evaluated on ideological commitment, professional activity, and bureaucratic productivity. By those metrics, even the most pointless torture could be considered successful research. The truth behind the myth becomes clear when we examine what Allied intelligence learned during the war. Captured documents, interrogated prisoners, intercepted communications. German military planners themselves recognized that most super-soldier experiments had produced nothing useful. A Wehrmacht medical report from 1943, discovered in captured archives, contains a devastating assessment. Enhancement programs have consumed substantial resources while providing minimal tactical benefit. Recommend reallocation of research funding to conventional medicine and injury treatment. The recommendation was ignored. The experiments continued. Not because they were working, but because the ideological framework couldn't accommodate failure. If Aryan superiority was real, then experiments pursuing it must eventually succeed. If they hadn't succeeded yet, that meant more experiments were needed, not fewer. The racial research was pure pseudoscience generating meaningless data. The surgical enhancements were fantasy. The genetic studies at Auschwitz contributed zero knowledge to medicine or biology. The vast majority of experiments served propaganda, ideology, and sadism rather than legitimate military needs. But, and this is the crucial complication, the methamphetamine program worked. Horribly, destructively, but effectively, in the short term. German soldiers did fight longer, march farther, conquer faster in 1940 partially due to chemical enhancement. The human experiments helped optimize these programs. The cost was addiction, psychological damage, and thousands of murdered experimental subjects, but the tactical advantage was real. This creates the disturbing legacy we still wrestle with. Most Nazi medical research was worthless. But some produced results. Some experiments, conducted through torture, generated data that influenced military operations. Some super-soldier programs, despite being based on twisted ideology, actually enhanced combat performance temporarily. The comfortable version of history has Nazi experiments producing nothing, all victims dying for absolutely no purpose. That version is mostly true, but not entirely. And the exceptions, the few programs that did work, create ethical complications that persist into the present. As the war turned against Germany after Stalingrad and D-Day, desperate fantasies about super-soldiers intensified. Himmler demanded miracle weapons and enhanced troops to reverse defeat. Resources flowed to increasingly irrational experiments. Reports from this period describe programs that crossed from unethical experimentation into pure delusion. Attempts to create soldiers who didn't need sleep. Surgical modifications intended to allow humans to see in complete darkness. Chemical treatments supposed to increase strength tenfold. All failed. All killed their subjects. None produced anything resembling the promised results, but the experiments accelerated rather than stopped. As reality closed in, ideology demanded ever more extreme measures. If conventional super-soldier programs hadn't produced miracle results, perhaps more extreme experiments would. If moderate doses of methamphetamine helped, perhaps massive doses would help more. If minor surgical modifications failed, perhaps radical procedures would succeed. The final year of the war saw the experimental programs descend into frantic, desperate attempts to achieve through atrocity what couldn't be achieved through strategy. No amount of torture could overcome Allied material superiority, strategic mistakes, and tactical incompetence at higher command levels. The super-soldier programs, having produced marginal tactical advantages at enormous moral cost, now accelerated into pure delusion as Germany's armies crumbled on all fronts. There's a document that surfaced in East German archives in 1991, a memo from Heinrich Himmler dated December 19, 1944. By this point, Soviet armies were approaching the German border from the east. The Western Allies controlled France and were pushing toward the Rhine. Defeat was inevitable to anyone capable of reading a map. Himmler's memo reads, "All enhancement programs will continue at maximum intensity. The Führer has complete confidence that German science will produce the breakthrough that reverses our temporary setbacks. Recommend expanding subject allocation to experimental facilities. Temporary setbacks. The delusion is staggering. Germany was being crushed from two directions. Cities were burning from Allied bombing, the military was collapsing. And Himmler wanted to expand the experiments, believing that torturing more prisoners would somehow produce super soldiers capable of changing the war's outcome. The memo was never acted upon by December 1944. The camp system was too chaotic to implement new programs. But it reveals the mentality at the highest levels. The experiments would continue until the very end, not because they were working, but because admitting failure was psychologically impossible. When we assess whether Nazi human enhancement programs created superior soldiers, the answer depends on what we mean by superior. Did they create soldiers with superhuman abilities, genetic advantages, or enhanced physiology? No. Almost all those programs failed completely. Did they create soldiers who could fight longer through chemical stimulation, who could endure conditions that would normally break them, who could sustain combat operations at tempo their enemies couldn't match? Yes, temporarily, at terrible cost. The methamphetamine program worked in the narrow sense of providing short-term tactical advantages, but it created long-term health problems, addiction, and psychological damage that ultimately hurt German military effectiveness. Its success in 1940 became liability by 1943. The other programs, altitude experiments, freezing research, surgical enhancements, genetic studies produced little to nothing of military value. They consumed resources, killed thousands, and advanced careers. But they didn't create super soldiers or provide significant tactical advantages. Yet the experiments continued because the system wasn't designed to produce super soldiers. It was designed to demonstrate ideological commitment, reward professional activity, and provide scientific veneer for atrocity. By those criteria, even failed experiments succeeded. The battlefield test of Nazi super soldier programs reveals an uncomfortable truth. Human enhancement through extreme measures can produce short-term results while creating long-term disasters. Chemical stimulation works until addiction destroys effectiveness. Psychological conditioning creates determination until it creates inflexibility. Surgical modification causes complications without providing advantages. The programs achieved marginal tactical benefits at enormous moral, medical, and strategic costs. The costs ultimately exceeded the benefits: chemically dependent troops, psychologically damaged soldiers, experimental subjects killed or permanently injured, resources wasted on pseudoscientific research. But those marginal benefits did exist. That's what makes the legacy so troubling. If the experiments had produced absolutely nothing, the moral calculus would be simpler. They produced almost nothing, which is nearly the same, but not quite. The exceptions, the rare cases where torture generated useful data, where atrocity influenced military operations, create ethical tangles we still haven't unraveled. Modern military enhancement programs, pharmaceutical alertness aids, psychological resilience training, equipment that amplifies human capabilities, all trace uncomfortable lineages to Nazi experiments. How do we pursue legitimate enhancement while avoiding the ethical collapse that consumed Nazi medical research? Where are the boundaries? Who draws them? What happens when tactical advantage tempts us to cross them? These questions outlasted the Third Reich. They persist wherever military necessity meets medical ethics, wherever tactical advantage tempts people to compromise principles, wherever the seductive promise of creating superior soldiers encounters the messy reality of human limitations. The Nazi experiments provided a warning that pursuing human enhancement without ethical constraints leads to atrocity. But they also provided a troubling complication, that atrocity sometimes produces results. The warning is clear. The complication remains unsolved. As 1945 began, with Germany facing imminent defeat, the experimental programs entered their final phase, not because they succeeded or failed on their own terms, but because the entire system supporting them was about to collapse. The camps would be liberated, the evidence would be discovered, the doctors would face judgment. But before that came one final question: What to do with the research? Destroy it to hide crimes? Preserve it, hoping to bargain immunity for data? The choices perpetrators made in the final months would shape post-war justice and, more disturbingly, would determine what happened to the experimental findings. Some data was destroyed, some was preserved. Some disappeared into intelligence archives, and some, perhaps the most troubling portion, may have been quietly used, its origins obscured, its moral taint laundered through time and classification. The battlefield had tested whether super-soldier experiments worked. The answer was mixed, uncomfortable, and incomplete. The question of what happened to the knowledge they produced, that question remains partially unanswered, its full truth hidden in files that may never be declassified. The telegram arrived at Auschwitz administration on January 15, 1945. 3 words: evacuate immediately westward. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, growing louder each day. The Red Army was closing in, crushing German defenses, advancing toward the camp complex with unstoppable momentum. Camp administrators had perhaps 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, before Soviet troops arrived. 2 weeks to dismantle the largest concentration camp complex in the Nazi system. 2 weeks to destroy evidence of what had happened there. 2 weeks to eliminate witnesses. The SS faced a choice: follow standard protocol, shoot all prisoners, burn all records, demolish all facilities, leave nothing for the Soviets to discover, or attempt evacuation, march prisoners westward to camps still under German control, preserve what could be saved, hope some prisoners would die on the march while others could be used as labor or subjects elsewhere. They chose both. The death marches began on January 17th, 60,000 prisoners forced to walk toward Germany in the middle of winter. Those too weak to walk were shot. The sick, the elderly, the children, anyone who couldn't maintain the pace died where they fell or were killed by guards. Thousands died on the roads between Auschwitz and camps deeper in the shrinking Reich. But here's what makes those final days particularly significant for understanding the experimental programs. Doctors faced decisions about what to preserve. Joseph Mengele packed 19 months of twin experiment documentation, tissue samples, photographs, notebooks, measurement records. He couldn't bear to destroy his life's work, even though possessing it would identify him as a war criminal. Other doctors made similar choices. Some burned their records, some buried them, some hid them in hopes of retrieving them later. The question that haunts archival research: how much documentation was preserved versus destroyed? What we know about Nazi experiments comes from documents that survived. What don't we know because those documents burned? At Ravensbrück, Karl Gebhardt received similar orders. The Red Army was approaching from the east. Evacuation or execution. He chose to preserve his surgical experiment records, carefully packed files describing wound infections, treatment protocols, experimental outcomes. His research defending his treatment of Heydrich was too valuable to destroy, he believed. Perhaps it would vindicate him. Perhaps it would save him. At Dachau, Sigmund Rascher's widow attempted to burn his hypothermia and altitude experiment records. Most burned successfully, but some papers survived, scattered pages, hidden among other documents, individual reports filed in unexpected locations, fragments that escaped complete destruction. These fragments, discovered years later in various archives, provide glimpses of experiments that left more extensive documentation that was destroyed. Here's what this tells us: the destruction of evidence was rushed, incomplete, inconsistent. Some doctors meticulously destroyed everything. Others tried to preserve their research. Still others simply fled, leaving documents where they fell. The result is a historical record full of gaps, pieces of evidence scattered across archives in multiple countries. Fragmentary documentation that hints at larger programs, survivor testimony describing experiments that left no paper trail. We know some of what happened, we suspect more. We'll never know everything. The vacuum where destroyed documentation once existed can never be filled. And in that vacuum, questions multiply. While doctors packed or burned their research, prisoners engaged in desperate preservation of their own. At Auschwitz, members of the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work in gas chambers had been documenting atrocities for months, burying written testimony in metal containers, creating a record for whoever eventually liberated the camp. These men knew they would likely be murdered before liberation. The SS couldn't allow witnesses to survive who had seen the gas chamber's inner workings, but they fought to ensure their testimony would survive, even if they didn't. They buried notes describing what they'd seen, listing names of perpetrators, documenting the industrial process of mass murder. Some of these buried testimonies were discovered after liberation. Others remain undiscovered, if they exist at all. The men who buried them were mostly killed in the camp's final days, taking knowledge of burial locations with them. Occasional discoveries continue in 1962, 1980, 2009. Each discovery reveals new details, confirms survivor testimony, adds pieces to the incomplete historical puzzle. But how many containers remain unfound? How many testimonies are still buried at Auschwitz, waiting for discovery? How much do those undiscovered testimonies contain that would change our understanding of the experiments? The official excavations ended decades ago. The ground at Auschwitz-Birkenau is now memorial land, protected from disturbance. Whatever remains buried will likely stay buried. The incomplete testimony remains incomplete. The questions it might have answered will persist unanswered. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz. They found 7,000 prisoners left behind too sick or weak to evacuate, abandoned to die or be liberated, depending on whether the SS or Red Army arrived first. The Soviet soldiers, veterans of brutal combat who had seen the worst of war, stood stunned before what they discovered. Warehouses containing 7 tons of human hair, sorted by color and texture, packed for shipment to German factories. Mountains of shoes, over 100,000 pairs sorted by size. Rooms full of eyeglasses, prosthetic limbs, children's clothing. The industrial infrastructure of mass murder, laid bare. In Mengelé's abandoned laboratory, they found experimental equipment, jars containing tissue samples, scattered paperwork describing twin experiments. Mengele himself was gone, fled westward days earlier, beginning a journey that would eventually take him to South America and 34 more years of freedom. Soviet photographers documented everything. But here's what's interesting about the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz. The documentation was incomplete and politically filtered. Stalin's Soviet Union had its own propaganda interests. The full horror was documented for internal use, but public releases emphasized Nazi crimes against Soviet citizens, downplaying the targeted genocide of Jews. Medical experiments were mentioned but not emphasized. The focus was on mass murder in gas chambers. This means the Soviet documentation of Auschwitz, while extensive, served specific political purposes. Some details were highlighted, others were minimized, and some particularly details about medical experiments received less attention than they deserved. The first witnesses to Auschwitz's medical atrocities were Soviets, whose documentation was shaped by Cold War politics even before the Cold War formally began. Western understanding of Auschwitz's experimental programs would develop later, through survivor testimony and captured German documents, creating a historical record assembled from multiple sources with different biases and incomplete information. American forces liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. General Dwight Eisenhower visited days later and was appalled by what he saw. He ordered extensive documentation, photographs, films, written reports. He forced German civilians from nearby Weimar to tour the camp, witnessing what had been done in their nation's name. At Buchenwald, evidence of disease experiments remained. Survivors bore tattoos, identifying them as test subjects. Medical records documenting typhus and yellow fever experiments survived in partially burned files. American military doctors began documenting survivor testimony while simultaneously treating them for disease and starvation. At Dachau, liberated on April 29th, American troops found survivors of Russia's pressure chamber and hypothermia experiments, men with permanent frostbite damage, others with neurological impairment from oxygen deprivation. The physical evidence of experiments was written on survivors' bodies, scars, amputations, disabilities that testified to torture, even when documentation had been destroyed. But here's a detail that emerges from liberation records. Not all experimental evidence was immediately recognized. Some survivors didn't immediately disclose they'd been experimental subjects they feared being seen as contaminated, as medical curiosities rather than human beings. Some experiments left no visible scars. Some procedures had been so traumatic that survivors couldn't speak about them. The full scope of medical experiments emerged gradually, through survivor testimony collected over months and years, through discovery of hidden documents, through medical examinations revealing damage that victims initially kept hidden. The liberation provided first glimpses of the horror. The complete picture developed slowly, incompletely, as witnesses found courage to testify and evidence gradually surfaced. The race to capture perpetrators began immediately, but success was mixed. Some SS doctors were caught at liberation, unable to flee in time. Others had already evacuated, blending into the chaos of millions of displaced persons flooding across Germany. Still others had civilian identities they could resume, false papers prepared months earlier, escape routes planned through networks that would later be called rat lines. Josef Mengele successfully evaded immediate capture by disguising himself as a regular Wehrmacht soldier. He was briefly held in an American POW camp, but wasn't identified. His name was on wanted lists, but the lists hadn't reached all units, and Mengele looked nothing like the monster survivors described. He appeared as a tired, ordinary soldier among millions. He was released from the POW camp in summer 1945 and lived in Bavaria under his real name for nearly 4 years, working as a farmhand. How did the most wanted Nazi doctor avoid capture for 4 years in occupied Germany? His name was known. Survivors had described him. Yet somehow he remained free until escaping to Italy in 1949, then to Argentina via Vatican rat lines. The Vatican's role in Nazi escape routes remains partially obscured by closed archives. We know that sympathetic priests operated networks moving war criminals to South America. We know Mengele used these routes. What we don't know fully is who knew what, who authorized what assistance, how many other doctors escaped the same way. Some priests acted individually, believing they were helping souls in need of mercy. Others operated with institutional knowledge, if not approval. The Vatican has released some documentation, but not all. Key archives remain sealed. The full story of how Mengele and others reached Argentina may never be completely known. As camps were liberated, the human cost became clear. Exact numbers of experimental victims will never be known. Records were destroyed. Many victims died without documentation. Countless experiments were never formally recorded. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands died as direct experimental subjects. Hundreds of thousands more died from forced labor and deliberate starvation in camps that also housed experimental facilities. The numbers are estimates because the system itself obscured the counting. A prisoner selected for experiments might be recorded as dying from natural causes or accident or simply deceased. The cause of death, deliberate infection, surgical experimentation, drug testing might not appear in official records even when those records survived. Survivors faced impossible trauma, physical damage, sterilization victims unable to have children, freezing experiment subjects with amputated limbs, surgical experiment victims bearing horrific scars. But psychological trauma ran deeper. Nightmares, survivor guilt, an inability to trust medical professionals. Many could never speak about what they'd endured. Others felt compelled to testify, turning trauma into witness, ensuring the world knew what had been done. The Polish women from Ravensbrück's surgical experiments, the rabbits, exemplify this choice to become witnesses. Despite permanent disabilities and chronic pain, many testified at war crimes, trials. They removed their clothes to show judges their mutilated legs. They described the procedures, named the doctors, provided evidence that was crucial for convictions. Their willingness to testify, to relive trauma publicly, to let judges and lawyers and photographers document their damaged bodies, this represents a different kind of courage than battlefield heroism. They chose to be seen in their vulnerability, to make their suffering visible, To prevent denial and ensure accountability, Allied powers faced decisions about captured Nazi medical personnel. Some cases were clear doctors caught at camps, with documentation proving their crimes, would stand trial. But others occupied grey areas. Military doctors who participated in experiments claimed they followed orders, that refusing meant death, that they tried to help prisoners within the system's constraints, and troubling questions emerged. Did any experiments produce medically useful data? Should that data be used if it came from torture? Can knowledge gained through murder ever be ethically applied? Intelligence agencies from multiple nations approached captured doctors with proposals. The Cold War was beginning. Both American and Soviet authorities wanted German scientific expertise. Operation Paperclip, the American program recruiting German scientists, would eventually bring 1,600 German experts to the United States. The program focused primarily on rocket scientists and engineers, but it included medical researchers, not camp doctors with obvious war crimes those faced trial, but aviation medicine specialists, pharmaceutical researchers, doctors whose experimentation existed in ethical grey zones. Their value to Cold War competition outweighed concerns about their wartime activities. The Soviets conducted parallel recruitment on an even larger scale. They captured scientists in eastern territories and forced them to work in closed cities. Some concentration camp doctors ended up in Soviet research facilities, their knowledge exploited before they were eventually imprisoned or executed. The Soviet recruitment was less selective than American. They took whoever had technical expertise, war crimes notwithstanding. Here's what this created: a bifurcated justice system. High-profile perpetrators faced trial, lower-profile specialists received job offers. The decisions about who got prosecuted versus who got recruited were made by intelligence agencies weighing Cold War advantage against moral principle. Moral principle didn't always win. By summer 1945, as war in Europe ended, evidence accumulated in Allied archives, millions of pages of documentation, thousands of survivor testimonies, photographs too horrific to publish in newspapers, physical evidence from liberated camps. The scale and systematic nature of Nazi medical crimes became undeniable. The world demanded justice. Plans began for trials not just of military and political leaders, but specifically of medical professionals who transformed healing into torture. The Nuremberg doctors' trial would open in December 1946, representing humanity's first attempt to hold medical professionals accountable for crimes committed in the name of science. But even as prosecutors prepared cases, the incomplete nature of justice became apparent. Mengele was free in South America. Hundreds of lower-level camp doctors had escaped prosecution entirely, fading into post-war chaos, resuming medical practice under assumed names or in locations where their pasts weren't scrutinized. Karl Klauberg was captured by Soviets but not immediately charged. He eventually received a surprisingly light sentence in exchange for continuing sterilization research for Soviet authorities, the very research he'd conducted on prisoners at Auschwitz. His techniques were valuable enough that Soviet intelligence overlooked his crimes to exploit his expertise. The pattern repeating across multiple countries. Knowledge gained through atrocity retained value despite its tainted origins. Intelligence agencies, military medical corps, and pharmaceutical companies all faced the same question: should we use this data, or does using it validate the experiments? The official answer was usually no. The actual answer, hidden in classified files and undocumented decisions, may have been different. We know some Nazi doctors were recruited. We know some data was preserved rather than destroyed. What we don't know completely is what happened to that data, how it was used, whether Cold War research built on concentration camp experiments while obscuring the connection. There's a curious pattern in declassified American intelligence files. Medical research documents from captured Nazi archives have release dates scattered across decades. Some were declassified in the 1960s, others in the 1980s, some in the 2000s, a few remain classified. Why the staggered releases? Why are some documents still withheld? The official explanation is that full review takes time, that documents were processed as resources allowed, that remaining classified materials protect intelligence sources and methods, but the pattern suggests another possibility. That documents were released when their content became less sensitive, when enough time passed that connections to current programs became obscure. When Cold War competitors had similar capabilities rendering secrecy pointless, when witnesses died, and questions about post-war use of Nazi data became historical rather than current. The documents that remain classified, what do they contain? Experimental findings too valuable to release. Evidence of post-war American or Soviet programs building on Nazi research, or simply mundane materials that haven't been reviewed yet due to bureaucratic backlog? We can't know. That's the point. The gaps in declassified materials create space for questions that may never be answered, and those unanswered questions shadow everything we think we know about what happened to Nazi medical research after the war. Survivors watched the liberation and its aftermath with mixed emotions. Relief that the nightmare had ended. Horror at discovering the full scope of what had been done. Many prisoners knew only their own camp's conditions, not the system's full extent. Grief for those who didn't survive, and frustration at the incomplete nature of justice they saw emerging. The twin survivors of Mengele's experiments felt particular frustration. Their tormentor was free, living somewhere unknown, never facing consequences for killing hundreds of children. For them, liberation brought survival but not closure. Justice remained incomplete as long as Mengele lived freely. The women sterilized by Clawberg faced a different incompleteness. Many wanted children but couldn't have them a permanent reminder of what had been done to them. When they learned Clawberg was continuing his research for the Soviets rather than facing full accountability, their sense of injustice intensified. The experiments that destroyed their fertility were still happening, just under different management. The men who survived Rascher's experiments discovered that much of his data had been destroyed or lost. Part of them was relieved the documentation of their torture wouldn't persist, but part of them wondered if destroying the evidence made their suffering somehow less real, as if it hadn't happened if no records proved it. This tension between wanting evidence destroyed and wanting it preserved reflects a deeper ambivalence survivors felt about documentation. Preserved evidence meant their trauma was validated, crimes could be proven, perpetrators could be held accountable, but it also meant their worst moments were recorded forever, available for historians and researchers to examine, their suffering transformed into data points in scholarly analysis. The stage was set for the Nuremberg doctors' trial, but the trial would only scratch the surface of a system that corrupted an entire profession. Thousands of doctors and nurses participated in or enabled experiments. 23 stood trial. 7 were executed. The arithmetic of justice didn't balance. Full reckoning, if such a thing was even possible, would take decades. Nazi hunters would pursue fugitives across South America. Survivors would testify in trials scattered across multiple countries. Doctors who thought they'd escaped would be found decades later, brought to trial in old age, finally held accountable. But many escaped entirely. They lived quiet lives, practiced medicine, raised families, died peacefully, having never faced consequences for what they'd done. The final accounting of Nazi medical crimes includes this uncomfortable fact. Most perpetrators were never punished. The justice system caught some. Many more slipped through. And the knowledge they generated, the data from experiments, the techniques they developed, the findings they documented, that knowledge persisted beyond the perpetrators themselves. Some was destroyed. Some was preserved in archives. Some disappeared into classified intelligence files. And some, perhaps the most troubling portion, may have been quietly used, its origins obscured, its moral taint gradually forgotten as decades passed. There's a moment in liberation footage that survivors often cite as capturing the transition from imprisonment to uncertain freedom. An American soldier offers food to a starving prisoner. The prisoner reaches out tentatively, as if the food might be taken away, as if this might be another cruel experiment testing hope and despair. The soldier says something we can't hear what in the silent footage. The prisoner begins to cry, then to eat. The simple act of receiving food without it being conditional, without it being part of some test or experiment, breaks something in him. He realizes it's finally over. But is it? Other footage from Liberation shows prisoners staring at cameras with expressions that mix relief with something harder to name. Uncertainty. Trauma. The knowledge that survival doesn't mean healing, that liberation doesn't mean return to who they were before. For those who survived medical experiments, liberation was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Living with permanent physical damage, coping with psychological trauma, deciding whether to speak about what happened or try to forget, learning to exist in a world that would never fully understand what they'd endured. The camps closed. The experimental apparatus was dismantled, but its effects persisted in the bodies and minds of survivors, in the gaps in the historical record, in the questions that would never be fully answered about what happened to the research, in the incomplete justice that would haunt survivors and perpetrators alike. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the geography of atrocity slowly came into focus. Camp by camp, testimony by testimony, document by document, the world began to understand what had been hidden behind barbed wire and military security. But understanding came incomplete. Some evidence was destroyed. Some witnesses were dead. Some perpetrators had fled. And some knowledge about what the experiments actually produced, about where the data went, about whether it was ever used, that knowledge remained fragmentary, contested, shadowed by questions that subsequent decades would only partially illuminate. The liberation marked an ending, but it also marked a beginning of trials, of testimony, of survivors bearing witness, of historians trying to reconstruct what happened from incomplete evidence, of ethicists grappling with impossible questions about knowledge gained through evil. The machinery of horror had been dismantled, but the questions it raised about human nature, about institutional failure, about what happens when ideology overrides ethics, those questions survived liberation intact. They would shape medical ethics, inform human rights law, haunt philosophical debates for generations. And in the shadows, in the gaps between what we know and what we suspect, in the files that remain classified, and the testimony that was never given, other questions persisted. Questions about what really happened in facilities that left no traces, about experiments that weren't documented, about data that disappeared into intelligence archives, about whether the full truth of Nazi medical crimes would ever be completely known. The camps were liberated. The perpetrators faced judgment or fled into hiding. The survivors began the long, incomplete process of healing and testimony. But the darkness that spawned the experiments, that capacity within human nature, within institutions, within scientific inquiry. When ethics collapsed, that darkness wasn't destroyed by liberation. It merely withdrew, waiting for whatever future circumstances might summon it again. On December 9, 1946, 23 defendants entered courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg. They weren't military commanders or political leaders. They were doctors, men who had sworn oaths to heal and protect life. Men who now faced charges of conducting criminal medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, of murder disguised as research, of betraying the foundational ethics of their profession. The doctors' trial, officially United States of America, v. Karl Brandt et al., represented humanity's first attempt to hold medical professionals accountable for crimes committed in the name of science. The proceedings would last 7 months. They would produce 10,000 pages of transcript. They would result in 16 convictions, 7 death sentences, and a code of medical ethics that would shape research regulations worldwide. But here's what the trial couldn't do: deliver complete justice. The most notorious perpetrator, Josef Mengele, was absent, living freely in Bavaria. Hundreds of lower-level camp doctors escaped prosecution entirely. Some had already been recruited by American or Soviet intelligence agencies, their expertise valued more than their punishment. The trial could only address the fraction of criminals who were both identified and captured. Chief Prosecutor Brigadier General Telford Taylor opened with words that echoed through the courtroom. The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The victims were the unfortunate thousands who were compelled to submit to medical experiments without their consent. Thousands. But how many thousands? The exact number would never be determined. Records were destroyed. Victims died without documentation. The trial could prove specific crimes against specific individuals. The full scope of atrocity exceeded what any trial could encompass. The lead defendant was Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, the highest medical authority in Nazi Germany. Beside him sat men whose names survivors knew with terror. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who supervised surgical experiments at Ravensbrück. Dr. Siegfried Handloser, Chief Medical Officer of the Wehrmacht. Dr. Oskar Schroeder, Head of Luftwaffe Medical Services. Notably absent, Joseph Mengele. Sigmund Rasche, dead in Dachau in 1945, executed by the SS, not for his experiments but for fraud involving a personal scandal. Karl Klauberg, captured by Soviets, not present at this trial, his fate to be decided by different courts with different agendas. The prosecution began presenting evidence that made even hardened judges visibly disturbed. Photographs of prisoners immersed in ice water tanks, their faces contorted in agony, documents revealing requisition orders treating human beings as laboratory supplies. Request 100 healthy prisoners for experimental purposes. Charts measuring how long subjects survived at various simulated altitudes before death occurred. Then came survivor testimony. This was when the abstract horror became human. A Polish woman named Jadwiga Dzido approached the witness stand in February 1947. She removed her stockings to reveal her scarred leg, the result of Dr. Gebhardt's surgical experiments at Ravensbrück. She described how doctors deliberately infected wounds with bacteria, glass, and wood fragments, then tested whether sulfur drugs could cure the infections. Some women died from gangrene. Those who survived endured operations without anesthesia, watching their flesh rot before experimental treatments either worked or failed. Her testimony brought the atrocities from abstract documentation to immediate human reality. This wasn't statistics. This was a woman standing before judges, showing them what had been done to her body, naming the doctor who did it. Gebhardt sat in the dock, listening to her testimony, his face expressionless. Did he feel remorse, shame, or merely annoyance at facing consequences for research he still believed was justified? His later statements suggest the third option. To the end, he maintained that the experiments were necessary, that military necessity justified his actions, that he was simply doing his duty. More survivors testified. Twin survivors of Mengele's experiments described watching their siblings die. Men described Rasche's freezing experiments being submerged in ice water for hours while doctors watched and took notes. Women explained Klauberg's sterilization injections and the permanent damage they caused. Each testimony chipped away at the defendants' attempts to claim they were merely following orders or conducting legitimate research. The human cost of their research sat before the court, bearing scars, describing trauma, naming perpetrators. But here's what the testimony also revealed. The experiments were even more extensive than documented evidence suggested. Survivors described procedures that matched no known protocols. They mentioned doctors whose names didn't appear in captured records. They testified to experiments at facilities that hadn't been thoroughly investigated. The trial could only address documented crimes. What about undocumented crimes? What about experiments that left no paper trail? What about victims who didn't survive to testify? The testimony that was heard suggested vast testimony that would never be heard: prisoners who died without speaking, crimes committed without documentation, atrocities that would remain forever unknown. The defense strategy revealed moral bankruptcy. Defense attorneys argued that experiments were justified by military necessity, that subjects were condemned prisoners who would have died anyway, that German doctors were no different from Allied researchers who also conducted experiments on prisoners and soldiers. They attempted to introduce evidence of American research on prisoners' malaria experiments, radiation studies. They tried to establish moral equivalence. If Allied doctors experimented on prisoners, how could they condemn German doctors for the same? The judges allowed limited discussion, but ultimately rejected the comparison. Consent. Distinguished legitimate medical research from torture. Risk distinguished therapeutic trials from lethal experiments. Oversight distinguished regulated research from systematic atrocity. The differences were fundamental, not superficial. Several defendants claimed they were forced to participate, that refusing meant death. Others argued they tried to help prisoners within the system's constraints, that they provided better conditions than prisoners would otherwise receive. Dr. Kurt Blome testified he conducted plague research as a defensive measure against potential Allied biological weapons. The prosecutors systematically demolished these defenses. They presented documents showing defendants volunteered for experimental assignments, sought promotions through experimental work, published papers taking credit for their research. They demonstrated that military necessity cannot justify murder, that experimental subjects were not condemned prisoners but healthy individuals selected specifically for experiments. Crucially, they showed that even within Nazi Germany's evil system, some doctors refused participation and faced no severe consequences. This undermined claims of compulsion. Refusal was possible, some doctors chose it, most didn't. The prosecution introduced a concept that would reshape international law: crimes against humanity. Acts so fundamentally evil they violate universal human rights regardless of local laws or orders. Medical experiments without consent, torture in the name of science, murder of experimental subjects, these constituted crimes against humanity itself, not merely violations of existing German or international law. This legal framework, developed specifically for Nazi prosecutions, established new precedents. Individuals could be held accountable for systematic atrocities, even when following orders from legitimate authorities. Just following orders was not a defense. Each person bore responsibility for their choices, regardless of pressure or commands from superiors. The framework would influence international human rights law for generations, but it couldn't be applied retroactively to all perpetrators. Only those on trial faced judgment under these new standards. The hundreds who escaped would never be held accountable under this framework, would never face these charges, would die having avoided the consequences the law now prescribed. As testimony concluded over 7 months, the judges drafted what would become the Nuremberg Code 10 principles, establishing ethical requirements for human experimentation. The first principle stated unequivocally, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." Voluntary consent. The words seem obvious now, but they weren't codified in international law before Nuremberg. Medical ethics existed as professional norms, not legal requirements. The Nazi experiments revealed that professional norms weren't sufficient. Legal frameworks were necessary to prevent future atrocities. The other principles followed logically. Experiments must benefit society. They must avoid unnecessary suffering. They must be conducted by qualified scientists. Subjects must be able to terminate participation at any time. The potential benefits must outweigh the risks. These principles, born from Nazi horrors, would shape medical ethics globally for generations. But here's the limitation. The Nuremberg Code had no enforcement mechanism. It was a moral statement, not binding law. Individual nations could choose to implement it or ignore it. Medical researchers could follow it or find ways around it. The code established ethical standards but couldn't guarantee they'd be followed. And indeed, violations would continue. American radiation experiments on unknowing subjects in the 1950s, the Tuskegee syphilis study. Pharmaceutical testing in developing nations with inadequate consent. The Nuremberg Code established what should be done. Reality was messier. On August 20, 1947, verdicts were announced. 16 defendants found guilty. 7 received death sentences. Karl Brandt, Karl Gebhardt, Joachim Rogowski, Wolfram Sievers, Victor Brack, Waldemar Hoven, and Rudolf Brandt. 9 received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 7 were acquitted judges, finding insufficient evidence connecting them directly to criminal experiments. The sentences generated immediate controversy. Many observers believed the acquittals represented justice denied, that all defendants clearly participated in or enabled experiments. Others argued the death sentences were too harsh, that these doctors were products of their system rather than uniquely evil individuals. The debate revealed fundamental questions about accountability. Can individuals be held fully responsible when acting within systematically evil institutions? Should following orders mitigate guilt? How do we punish systematic evil involving thousands of participants when only 23 stand trial? The trial provided no definitive answers to these questions. It established that some level of accountability was necessary and possible, but it couldn't resolve the deeper philosophical and moral dilemmas about individual versus collective guilt, about how to respond to institutional evil, about what justice means when the crimes exceed any punishment's capacity to address them. The executions occurred on June 2, 1948, at Landsberg Prison. 7 men who transformed medicine into torture died by hanging. Their deaths brought limited satisfaction to survivors. Justice had been partially served, but Mengele remained free. Hundreds of other perpetrators escaped entirely. The arithmetic of punishment didn't balance the scale of crimes. More troubling, the Cold War was already intruding on justice. Both American and Soviet authorities were recruiting Nazi doctors for intelligence and weapons programs. Dr. Kurt Blomy, who admitted conducting plague research, was acquitted at Nuremberg, then immediately hired by the United States Army Chemical Corps. Dr. Walter Schreiber, who supervised hypothermia experiments, was recruited by American military intelligence. Public outcry eventually forced his deportation to Argentina, but the pattern was clear. Cold War competition valued German expertise over accountability for German crimes. The Soviets were less selective. They captured Karl Klauberg and initially used him for research, continuing the sterilization experiments he'd conducted at Auschwitz, just for different masters. They later imprisoned him, but not immediately, not without first exploiting his knowledge. This created a bifurcated justice system. High-profile perpetrators faced trial and punishment. Lower-profile specialists received recruitment offers. The decision about who got prosecuted versus who got employed was made by intelligence agencies weighing strategic advantage against moral principle. Strategic advantage often won. Operation Paperclip, the American program recruiting German scientists, brought 1,600 German experts to the United States between 1945 and 1959. Official histories emphasize rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun. Less discussed are the medical researchers recruited despite questionable wartime backgrounds. How many Nazi doctors actually came to America? Intelligence files remain partially classified. What research did they conduct once in the United States? Some worked in aerospace medicine, others in biological and chemical weapons programs, still others in pharmaceutical research. Did their American work build on concentration camp experiments? Were they ever held accountable for past crimes, or did recruitment grant effective immunity? The full truth remains obscured by classification, by time, by institutional reluctance to acknowledge uncomfortable historical facts. A document discovered in declassified files in 2007 raised disturbing questions. It described a 1952 meeting where American military doctors discussed German hypothermia research. The meeting notes don't specify which German research Russia's concentration camp experiments or legitimate German military medical studies. The ambiguity may be deliberate. Did American researchers reference Nazi experimental data? The official position is no, that Nazi data was too tainted, too scientifically worthless to use. But the gaps in documentation, the classified files that remain sealed, the ambiguous references in partially declassified materials, these suggest the possibility that official positions and actual practices may have diverged. The pharmaceutical companies that contracted for human testing faced separate trials. IG Farben executives stood trial for their corporation's crimes, including contracting with the SS for concentration camp drug testing, using slave labor, profiting from atrocity. But corporate accountability proved even more elusive than individual prosecution. Companies claimed they didn't know prisoners were used without consent, that they contracted for standard drug testing that happened to occur in concentration camps. Lower-level executives received prison terms. Senior leadership largely avoided severe punishment. IG Farben was broken up during denazification. The successor companies Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, and others became global pharmaceutical giants. Their Nazi-era conduct faded into corporate history. Compensation for victims was minimal and delayed for decades. In 1999, German companies established a fund compensating slave laborers. But money paid 50-plus years later to elderly survivors felt less like justice than acknowledgement that real justice would never arrive. The companies that profited from human experimentation continued thriving while their victims struggled with poverty, health problems, and trauma. Here's what the corporate trials revealed. The experimental apparatus didn't rely solely on Nazi ideology or SS brutality. It was sustained by ordinary business incentives. Pharmaceutical companies wanted cost-effective drug testing. The concentration camps provided it. Executives made rational business decisions to contract for human testing, weighing costs against benefits, treating prisoners as resources rather than people. The banality of evil wasn't just a characteristic of bureaucrats following orders. It extended to corporate boardrooms where executives approved contracts for human drug testing, to accounting departments that tracked experimental costs, to research divisions that analyzed data generated through torture. The trials also revealed uncomfortable truths about Allied medical research. Defense attorneys introduced evidence of American experiments on prisoners, radiation studies on unknowing subjects, ethically questionable research. While judges rejected moral equivalence arguments, American experiments involved more oversight and consent than Nazi programs. The comparisons highlighted that medical ethics failures extended beyond Germany. The Nuremberg Code established principles that American researchers had also violated, creating obligations for reform beyond German borders. The trials forced all nations to confront their medical research practices, not just Germany. The result was gradual reform, slow, incomplete, resisted by researchers who saw ethics requirements as impediments to scientific progress. But reform did happen. Institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, ethical oversight of human subjects research. These developments emerged partly from Nuremberg. The Nazi experiments, in their very horror, created pressure for ethical frameworks that might prevent future atrocities. Whether those frameworks succeeded is debatable. Violations has continued, but the violations now occurred against established ethical standards, making them harder to justify, easier to condemn. Nuremberg didn't prevent all future unethical research. It made such research harder to conduct openly and easier to challenge when discovered. Survivors watched the trials with mixed emotions. Many felt relief seeing perpetrators punished, vindication that the world acknowledged their suffering. Others felt frustrated by acquittals and light sentences, by perpetrators who escaped entirely, by the sense that justice remained incomplete. For twin survivors, Mengelé's absence from the dock represented a wound that would never heal. The man who tortured them lived freely while they bore lifelong scars. His escape poisoned whatever satisfaction the trial's convictions provided. How could there be justice when the worst perpetrator faced no consequences? The women sterilized by Clawberg experienced similar frustration. Learning he was continuing research for the Soviets rather than facing full accountability compounded their sense of injustice. The experiments that destroyed their fertility hadn't even fully stopped. They'd just changed management. But some survivors found meaning in testimony. By speaking publicly about their experiences, by documenting what was done to them, by ensuring the world knew the truth, they transformed victimhood into witness. They couldn't undo what happened, but they could ensure it was remembered, understood, condemned. This testimonial role became increasingly important as the trial concluded. Living witnesses would carry the memory of Nazi medical crimes into the future. Their testimony would educate generations, inform ethical debates, provide human context for abstract principles. The survivors who chose to speak became guardians of memory, ensuring the lessons of Nuremberg would persist beyond the trial itself. By late 1948, as the final Nuremberg trials concluded, a disturbing pattern was clear. High-profile perpetrators received justice while many escaped. Cold War priorities compromised prosecution efforts. The full scope of medical crimes exceeded any tribunal's capacity to address. The trials established crucial precedents: the Nuremberg Code, crimes against humanity, individual accountability for systematic evil. But they delivered incomplete justice for complete horror. Most perpetrators were never punished. Most victims never saw their torturers face consequences. The question that haunted survivors and prosecutors alike: if medical professionals, sworn to healing and bound by ethical codes, could be transformed into torturers and murderers, what did this reveal about human nature? Were Nazi doctors aberrations, evil individuals in an evil system? Or did they represent a possibility within any medical system where ideology trumps ethics, where some lives are valued above others, where political power overrides professional integrity? The trials couldn't answer these questions, but they established that asking them was essential. Medical ethics must rest on universal principles, transcending national ideology, military necessity, or scientific curiosity. The human being must always remain a person, never merely experimental material. Consent must be freely given, not coerced. Physicians must serve patients' interests, not governments' agendas. These principles, written in response to Nazi atrocities, reflected aspirations as much as rules. They were guidelines for preventing future horrors, rather than guarantees against them. Their effectiveness would depend on whether future generations chose to uphold them when facing pressures similar to those that corrupted Nazi medicine. There's a photograph from the trial that captures something essential about the proceedings. It shows the defendants dock, 23 men in dark suits, some listening intently to testimony, others appearing bored or defiant. They look like professionals at a business conference, not monsters on trial for systematic torture and murder. That's the disturbing truth about Nazi doctors. They weren't obviously evil. They were ordinary men who made terrible choices within an evil system. Remove the context of their crimes, and they appear indistinguishable from any other group of middle-aged professionals. The photograph forces uncomfortable questions. Could we recognize such men if we encountered them today? Would we identify potential torturers before they act? Or would they appear as normal as these men in dark suits, their capacity for atrocity hidden until circumstances reveal it? The comfortable answer is that we'd recognize evil if we saw it. That Nazi doctors were obviously different from normal physicians. The photograph suggests otherwise. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a white coat and speaks in clinical language, and maintains professional demeanor while committing atrocities. As courtroom doors closed and defendants began serving sentences or mounted appeals, the world moved forward. Germany rebuilt. Survivors tried to reconstruct lives from trauma. Medical research continued, now theoretically bound by ethical codes born from Nazi crimes. But shadows lingered, questions remained, and the fear persisted that what happened once in the heart of civilized Europe might somehow, somewhere, happen again. The Nuremberg doctors' trial attempted to deliver justice. It succeeded partially. It failed completely to address the full scope of crimes, to punish all perpetrators, to prevent future atrocities. What it accomplished was establishing precedents, documenting horrors, and creating ethical frameworks that might prevent similar descents into medical barbarism. Whether those frameworks would hold when tested by future pressures remained an open question. The trial could document what happened. It could punish some perpetrators. It could establish principles. But it couldn't change human nature or guarantee that institutions would resist corruption when facing similar circumstances. The reckoning was incomplete. Justice was partial. The questions raised by Nazi medical experiments persisted beyond the trial, beyond the convictions, beyond the executions. They persisted as reminders of what humans are capable of when ethics collapse, when ideology overrides conscience, when the vulnerable are declared expendable in pursuit of abstract goals. And in the files that remained classified, in the documents that were destroyed, in the testimony that was never given, in the perpetrators who escaped, In the knowledge that may have been quietly used in all these gaps and absences, other questions persisted. Questions about what really happened, about where the research went, about whether the full truth would ever be known. The trial provided answers, but the shadows it cast suggested that some truths remained hidden, some crimes undocumented, some perpetrators unpunished, and some knowledge gained through atrocity, quietly preserved for purposes we can only suspect but never fully prove. 8 decades after Nazi Germany's collapse, fundamental questions about the human experiments remain unresolved. Some answers disappeared in flames, as camps were liberated and documents burned. Others hide in classified intelligence files still sealed from public view. Still others persist because powerful institutions prefer ambiguity to accountability. The mysteries range from specific what happened to individual perpetrators to profound can knowledge from torture ever be ethically used? Each unanswered question reveals something disturbing about justice, memory, and humanity's capacity for both evil and denial. But here's what makes these questions different from most historical mysteries. They're not ancient. They're not about civilizations that left only fragments. The experiments happened within living memory. Some survivors are still alive. The institutions involved, pharmaceutical companies, intelligence agencies, medical schools, still exist. The questions remain unanswered not because time has eroded the evidence, but because some truths are difficult, uncomfortable, or deliberately concealed. The mystery isn't what we can't know, it's what we choose not to know, or what powerful interests prevent us from knowing, or what we suspect but can never prove. The Mengele mystery haunts survivors most persistently. Josef Mengele, the angel of death, conducted some of the most horrific experiments at Auschwitz, yet never faced trial. After liberation, he lived in Bavaria under his real name until 1949, working as a farmhand while his victims testified at Nuremberg. 4 years, under his real name, in occupied Germany, his name was on wanted lists. Survivors had described him in detail. Intelligence agencies knew he was a priority target. Yet he remained free, eventually obtaining false papers, crossing into Italy via Vatican rat lines, and sailing to Argentina in 1949. How? The question has troubled Nazi hunters for decades. Was it simple bureaucratic failure, too many wanted criminals, too few investigators, lists that didn't reach all occupation zones? Or was something more deliberate involved? Did intelligence agencies know his location but choose not to act? The uncomfortable possibility that intelligence agencies located Mengele but decided against immediate capture gains credence from declassified documents showing similar cases. Other Nazi doctors were located, approached, offered deals. Some accepted, providing information about experiments in exchange for immunity or reduced charges. Did Mengele receive similar offers? Did he refuse? Or did intelligence agencies simply decide his capture was lower priority than other objectives? For 3 decades, Mengele lived in South America. Nazi hunters pursued him relentlessly. Simon Wiesenthal dedicated years to tracking him. Israeli Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in 1960, but somehow missed Mengele, who lived nearby. The near miss raises questions. Mossad had resources, intelligence networks, local contacts. They successfully located and captured Eichmann. How did Mengele, equally notorious, evade the same operation? Did he have protection? Did someone tip him off? Or was he simply lucky? German prosecutors issued arrest warrants. Rewards were posted. International pressure mounted. Yet Mengele evaded capture until dying from a stroke while swimming off Brazil's coast in 1979. He was 67 years old. He had lived freely for 34 years after escaping justice. His body was exhumed and identified through forensic analysis in 1985. DNA testing in 1992 confirmed identity beyond doubt. But questions multiplied rather than diminished. Why didn't Allied authorities prioritize his capture earlier? Did intelligence agencies know his location but choose not to act? What happened to his experimental data, the meticulous notes he evacuated from Auschwitz? That last question is particularly troubling. Mengele fled Auschwitz with his research materials. He guarded them carefully for years. Where are they now? Were they destroyed before his death? Hidden somewhere? Confiscated by authorities who never acknowledged having them? Some materials were recovered after his death: notebooks, photographs, scattered papers, but the volume recovered seems small compared to what survivors describe him collecting. Where's the rest? Did 19 months of obsessive documentation really reduce to a few recovered notebooks? Or is material missing? The data dilemma poses perhaps the most ethically challenging question. Should knowledge from torture ever be used? Some Nazi experiments, particularly the hypothermia studies, generated data about human responses to extreme cold. After the war, military researchers faced troubling choices. The data exists. It might save lives, rescue protocols for hypothermia victims, survival guidelines for cold water immersion, but using it validates torture, suggests the experiments had value, potentially encourages future unethical research. In 1984, researcher Robert Pozos proposed using Nazi hypothermia data in his work on cold water survival. The proposal ignited fierce debate. Survivors and ethicists argued that using the data dishonored victims, that scientific knowledge gained through murder can never be ethical to apply. Others contended that refusing to use data that might save lives compounds the tragedy, that the only way to give meaning to victims' suffering is extracting whatever good might come from evil. The debate revealed deeper questions. Is the data even scientifically valid? Nazi experiments lacked proper controls, standardized protocols, peer review. Russia's freezing studies were sadistic rather than systematic. Can results from such poorly designed experiments be trusted? Many scientists argue the Nazi data is worthless not for ethical reasons but because it's bad science, so corrupted by ideology and cruelty that it cannot inform legitimate research. The experiments measured variables that don't exist in actual rescue scenarios. The torture elements contaminated whatever findings might otherwise have value. The data is scientifically useless, making the ethical debate moot. But that comfortable conclusion faces a problem. Rumors persist that military and medical institutions quietly used Nazi data for decades. Did American military researchers reference German hypothermia studies when developing cold water survival protocols? Did pharmaceutical companies benefit from concentration camp drug trials? The full truth remains hidden in classified archives and corporate records never subjected to public scrutiny. The official position is that Nazi data was too tainted to use. The gaps in documentation suggest actual practice may have diverged from official policy. A detail discovered in declassified Air Force medical research files in 2003. A 1957 report on high-altitude survival references German wartime studies without specifying which studies. The citation is deliberately vague. German military conducted extensive aviation medicine research during the war. Some was legitimate. Some consisted of Russia's lethal pressure chamber experiments at Dachau. Which studies did the 1957 report reference? The ambiguous citation could mean either, perhaps deliberately ambiguous, allowing researchers to benefit from data while maintaining deniable separation from its origins. This pattern vague references that could mean multiple things, citations that don't specify exactly which German research appears throughout Cold War-era military medical literature. Sometimes it probably refers to legitimate German research, sometimes, perhaps, to concentration camp experiments. The ambiguity prevents confirmation either way. This creates a troubling possibility that Nazi experimental data was laundered through deliberate ambiguity, referenced obliquely, cited without specifics, used while maintaining plausible deniability about the source. The knowledge gained through torture, persisting in research literature, its origins obscured but its influence real. Can we prove this happened? No. The evidence is suggestive but not definitive. Can we prove it didn't happen? Also no. The gaps in documentation, the ambiguous citations, the classified files that remain sealed, these prevent certain knowledge either way. We're left with uncomfortable suspicions that may never be confirmed or refuted. Which is, perhaps, exactly the situation some institutions prefer: doubt that prevents accusation but doesn't quite achieve innocence. The paperclip scandal continues, generating controversy. Operation Paperclip brought 1,600 German scientists to America between 1945 and 1959. Official histories emphasize rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun. Less discussed are medical researchers recruited despite questionable backgrounds. How many Nazi doctors actually came to America? Intelligence files remain partially classified. A 2006 review by the National Archives identified several doctors in the paperclip program who had worked in facilities where experiments occurred, not necessarily camp doctors themselves, but researchers who collaborated with or had knowledge of experimental programs. Were they ever held accountable? Most received security clearances, government positions, comfortable careers. Their wartime activities were investigated but often minimized or overlooked in pursuit of Cold War advantage. The calculation was explicit. Their knowledge outweighed their past crimes. What research did they conduct once in the United States? Some worked in aerospace medicine, arguably related to their legitimate German expertise. Others worked in biological and chemical weapons programs, more troubling connections. Still others in pharmaceutical research, raising questions about whether their American work built on concentration camp experiments. The full story remains obscured by classification. Files released through Freedom of Information Act requests arrive heavily redacted. Key documents remain withheld for national security reasons decades after the Cold War ended. What could those documents reveal that still requires secrecy? The obvious answer: that American intelligence agencies recruited doctors with deeper involvement in experiments than officially acknowledged, that some recruited doctors continued research related to their concentration camp work, that the gap between public denunciations of Nazi medicine and private exploitation of Nazi doctors was wider than comfortable historical narratives admit. The Soviet Union conducted parallel recruitment on even larger scale. They captured scientists in eastern territories and forced them to work in closed cities. What atrocities did Soviet-captured doctors reveal? What happened to their concentration camp research data? Russian archives remain largely sealed, preventing comprehensive understanding. We know Karl Klauberg was captured by Soviets and continued his sterilization research before eventual imprisonment. We know other camp doctors disappeared into the Soviet system, emerging years later in unexpected ways or not emerging at all. What happened during those years? What research did they conduct? What data did they provide? The Soviet records, when they exist at all, remain classified or were destroyed. The full story of Nazi doctors in Soviet service may never be told. The men who might have testified are dead. The institutions that employed them deny or obscure their involvement. The truth disappeared behind the Iron Curtain and hasn't fully emerged even after the Soviet Union's collapse. This creates parallel gaps: American classification, obscuring one side of Nazi doctor recruitment, Soviet secrecy obscuring the other. Both superpowers exploited German medical expertise. Both had reasons to conceal the full extent. Both created historical records with convenient absences, with questions that remain unanswerable because the evidence is hidden, destroyed, or deliberately withheld. The missing experiments haunt researchers studying Nazi medical crimes. Documentary evidence reveals hundreds of experimental programs across dozens of camps, but many records were destroyed before liberation. How many experiments occurred that left no documentation? Survivors describe procedures and tortures that match no known program. Were there secret facilities beyond the documented camps? Did experiments continue in remote locations after major camps were liberated? Persistent legends claim Hitler established secret research bases in remote locations: Antarctica, Argentina, underground facilities in Germany itself. Most historians dismiss these as conspiracy theories, but elements of mystery remain. German U-boats did operate in Argentine waters. Nazi officials did establish escape routes to South America. Small communities of German expatriates in remote regions raised questions for decades. Did any continue experimental work in isolation? The rumored Antarctic base, supposedly established during Germany's 1938 Neuschwabenland expedition, has never been located despite numerous searches. Did it ever exist? almost certainly not at the scale conspiracy theorists imagine. But did Germany establish any remote facilities for research they wanted hidden even from other Nazi agencies? Definitive answers remain elusive. A more mundane explanation for missing experiments is simpler: poor record-keeping at smaller camps, informal studies by individual doctors, pursuing personal interests, experiments abandoned before generating reports. The chaos of wartime and the deliberate destruction during collapse eliminated evidence of these programs. They happened, but they left no recoverable traces. Which explanation is correct? Probably the mundane one. But the exotic possibilities persist in absence of definitive proof either way. The gaps in documentation create space for speculation that historical evidence can neither confirm nor completely dispel. The complicity question extends beyond obvious perpetrators to thousands of participants and enablers. How many German civilians knew about experiments? Concentration camps stood near towns. Trains carrying prisoners passed through stations daily. Smoke from crematoria was visible for miles. More troubling, how many German doctors, nurses, and medical students were complicit? Mengele trained at prestigious universities. Russia presented research at medical conferences. Results from concentration camp experiments appeared in medical journals during the war. Academic institutions approved dissertations based on experiments conducted on prisoners. Thousands of medical professionals must have encountered this work. How many raised ethical concerns? How many refused participation? The answer appears to be remarkably few. After the war, German medical institutions faced hard questions about wartime complicity. Universities that hosted Nazi doctors, journals that published their research, professional societies that honored them all, confronted their roles in enabling atrocities. Some institutions acknowledged responsibility and reformed. Others minimized involvement, portraying Nazi doctors as aberrations rather than products of a corrupted professional culture. The denazification of German medicine proved incomplete. Many doctors who participated in or enabled experiments resumed practice after the war. Medical licensing boards often looked the other way. Professional societies avoided investigating members' wartime activities too aggressively. The pragmatic argument prevailed. Germany needed doctors. Most German doctors had been Nazi Party members or worked in the wartime medical system. Drawing lines between complicity and active participation proved difficult. Institutional interests often favored forgetting rather than investigating. This pattern extended beyond Germany. How many American or British doctors had pre-war professional relationships with German colleagues who became camp doctors? How many post-war resumed those relationships, glossing over wartime activities? The international medical community's response to Nazi medical crimes was condemnation in principle, but complicated in practice by personal relationships and professional networks that transcended national boundaries. The modern implications trouble contemporary bioethics. As genetic engineering, human enhancement, and biotechnology advance, Nazi experiments remain cautionary tales, but what specific lessons do they teach? China's recent genetic experiments on human embryos, creating genetically modified babies, sparked international condemnation and comparisons to Nazi eugenics. American bioethics boards still debate consent requirements for experimental treatments. Military research into human enhancement, cognitive improvement, strength augmentation, reduced sleep needs echoes. Wehrmacht supersoldier programs. The technologies differ, but fundamental questions remain. How far can we modify human biology before crossing from medicine into something darker? Who decides which enhancements are acceptable? What happens when military or economic pressure tempts researchers to compromise ethical standards? The disability rights movement points to troubling continuities between Nazi euthanasia programs and contemporary discussions of assisted suicide and prenatal testing for genetic conditions. When does preventing suffering become eliminating the suffering individual? Who decides which lives are worth living? Nazi programs began with these questions before descending into genocide. The fact that we still wrestle with similar questions suggests the lessons of Nazi medicine remain incompletely learned. The technologies change, the temptations persist. Modern researchers often assume they're different, that our ethics are stronger, our oversight more robust, our intentions more pure. But Nazi doctors believed they were ethical men making difficult choices for the greater good. They rationalized their actions using logic that seemed compelling within their ideological framework. The lesson isn't that all medical research is Nazi-like. It's that good intentions and scientific credentials don't guarantee ethical behavior. That institutional oversight can fail when ideology or pressure becomes strong enough. That the capacity for transforming healing into harm exists within any medical system under the right circumstances. The justice that never came haunts survivors and their descendants. Mengele died free. Hundreds of perpetrators escaped prosecution. Some lived comfortable lives in South America or the Middle East. Others returned to medical practice in Europe. Nazi hunters pursued them for decades. Simon Wiesenthal, Beate and Serge Klaasfeld, the Mossad's secret operations. Some fugitives were eventually captured and tried. Klaus Barbie extradited from Bolivia in 1983. John Demjanjuk tried in Germany in 2011, but many died peacefully in old age, never facing accountability. The pharmaceutical companies that profited from slave labor and human experiments paid limited reparations decades after the war. IG Farben was broken up, but successor companies thrived. Bayer, BASF, and others became global corporations, their Nazi-era crimes fading into historical footnotes. In 1999, German companies established a fund compensating slave laborers, but money paid 50-plus years later to elderly survivors feels less like justice than acknowledgement that real justice will never arrive. The companies that used prisoners as experimental subjects continue operating. The executives who approved those contracts died unpunished. The profits generated through atrocity were never fully returned. Survivors and their descendants continue discovering new evidence decades later. In 2006, researchers found records of previously unknown experiments at Auschwitz. In 2013, German archives released files documenting Mengele's post-war years. Each new discovery reopens old wounds, reveals additional victims, confirms that the full scope of horror may never be completely known. There's a photograph that surfaced in 2011, discovered in a private collection being liquidated after the owner's death. It shows a man standing beside a swimming pool in Brazil, 1970s, based on the clothing and photographic style. The man is sunburned, relaxed, smiling. He's wearing sunglasses and holding a drink. Forensic analysis confirmed it's Joseph Mengele. Taken years before his death, during the decades he lived freely while his victims aged with their scars. The photograph captures something unbearable, not the monster of nightmares but an ordinary older man enjoying retirement in a tropical climate. This is what evil looks like when it escapes justice. Not dramatic, not obviously monstrous. Just a man beside a pool, living comfortably, facing no consequences for having murdered hundreds. The photograph raises a question that survivors asked for decades. How many other similar photographs exist? How many perpetrators lived equally comfortable lives, their crimes hidden or forgotten, their identities protected by time and distance and bureaucratic failures? We know about Mengele because he was notorious, because Nazi hunters never stopped searching. What about the less famous doctors, the ones who conducted smaller-scale experiments, who enabled larger programs without becoming household names, who slipped into post-war obscurity and died peacefully without ever facing questions about their wartime activities? The comfortable answer is that they were few, that most perpetrators faced justice or at least lived in fear of discovery. The evidence suggests otherwise. Most escaped completely, most lived ordinary post-war lives, most died having never paid for their crimes. The ultimate question transcends specific mysteries. How did this happen? How did physicians sworn to heal become architects of torture? How did an educated, cultured nation embrace systematic atrocity? Scholars, philosophers, and survivors have occupied themselves with these questions for 8 decades. Answers remain partial, incomplete, unsatisfying. Nazi doctors weren't monsters born evil, They were ordinary people who made terrible choices within an evil system. They rationalized cruelty as scientific progress. They dehumanized victims as racial inferiors. They prioritized career advancement over ethical principles. They believed the ends creating superior soldiers, advancing German power, serving the fatherland justified any means. But this explanation feels insufficient. It describes mechanisms without fully illuminating causes. Why did these particular individuals make these particular choices when others refused? What combination of ideology, psychology, situation, and individual character transforms healers into killers? The question remains open because human evil remains ultimately mysterious, resistant to complete explanation. We can identify contributing factors: ideological indoctrination, institutional pressure, career incentives, dehumanization of victims. But the final step, the moment when a doctor crosses from reluctant participation to enthusiastic cruelty, that moment remains opaque. Some sought it, some stumbled into it. Some were coerced initially but grew to embrace it. Each path was different, making unified explanation impossible. Evil isn't uniform. It emerges through multiple routes, responds to different motivations, takes various forms. As living survivors disappear, fewer than 100,000 Holocaust survivors remain worldwide as of 2025. The unanswered questions risk fading into purely academic debates, but survivors and their advocates insist the questions must stay alive. Museums, memorials, and educational programs work to preserve memory. Survivors' testimonies are recorded before they die. The physical evidence of camps is maintained as witness to what humans can do to other humans. But preservation faces challenges. How do you maintain urgency about events that occurred 80 years ago? How do you make distant history feel relevant to people born decades after? How do you teach about systematic atrocity without either trivializing it through repetition or making it so overwhelming that people turn away? The questions about Nazi experiments persist not because answers are impossible, but because the answers we have are incomplete and uncomfortable. They suggest that the capacity for such evil doesn't reside in particular nations or eras, but within human nature itself. That institutional safeguards can fail, that good intentions don't guarantee ethical outcomes, that knowledge can be weaponized regardless of how it's obtained, and perhaps most disturbing, that some experiments did produce results, that atrocity sometimes generates useful data, that the clean moral narrative evil producing nothing doesn't fully capture historical complexity. The uncomfortable truth is that ethics and effectiveness can diverge, that wrong methods can produce right results, that we must choose not to use knowledge despite its utility rather than because it lacks utility. The darkest question, the one that keeps historians and ethicists wakeful, is whether it could happen again. Not identically, history doesn't repeat precisely, but could some future ideology, some crisis, some combination of circumstances transform medicine into torture, science into systematic atrocity? The Nazi experiments warn that the capacity for such evil doesn't reside in particular nations or eras, but within human nature itself, waiting for the right combination of ideology, opportunity, and moral failure to emerge. The safeguards established after Nuremberg ethical review boards, informed consent requirements, international oversight, these represent barriers against repetition, but barriers can be circumvented, weakened, or deliberately dismantled when pressure becomes strong enough. Recent history provides troubling examples: medical experiments conducted on prisoners without meaningful consent, pharmaceutical trials in developing nations with inadequate oversight, military research pushing ethical boundaries in pursuit of tactical advantage. These aren't Nazi-scale atrocities, but they demonstrate that the impulse to compromise ethics for perceived benefits persists. The question isn't whether modern medicine is Nazi-like. It isn't. The question is whether the factors that enabled Nazi medical crimes, ideological pressure, institutional failure, career incentives that reward unethical behavior, dehumanization of vulnerable populations could align again under different circumstances. The comfortable answer is no, that we've learned our lessons, that it could never happen again? The honest answer is that we don't know. The safeguards exist. But safeguards require constant vigilance, ethical courage, willingness to resist pressure even at personal cost. Whether future generations will maintain that vigilance remains uncertain. 8 decades after liberation, we cannot confidently answer whether we're vigilant enough, ethical enough, strong enough to prevent such horrors from recurring. And that uncertainty, that knowledge of human capacity for evil, remains the most haunting legacy of Nazi human experiments. Not just what they did, but what they reveal about what we might do if ethics, oversight, and humanity's better nature ever fail again. The questions that remain unanswered about specific perpetrators, about hidden data, about the full scope of experiments, matter less than the fundamental question they collectively pose. What happens when medicine abandons ethics, when science serves ideology, when human beings become experimental materials? The answer is documented in survivor testimony, in liberation photographs, in trial transcripts, in ethical codes written in response to atrocity. But it's also hidden in classified files, in destroyed documents, in testimony never given, in perpetrators who escaped justice, in knowledge that may have been quietly used despite public condemnation. The complete truth of Nazi medical experiments will never be fully known. Too much evidence was destroyed. Too many witnesses died. Too many perpetrators escaped. Too many powerful institutions have reasons to prefer certain questions remain unanswered. What we know is enough to horrify. What we don't know may be worse. And the knowledge that vast portions of the truth remain hidden, obscured, or deliberately concealed, that knowledge adds another layer to the horror. The experiments ended with Germany's defeat. But their legacy persists in the questions they raised, the ethical frameworks they necessitated, the institutional failures they exposed, and the disturbing reminder that human capacity for transforming healing into systematic torture remains, waiting in the shadows of history, ready to emerge whenever circumstances align and vigilance fails. We remember not because remembering is comfortable, but because forgetting is dangerous. We preserve the questions not because we can answer them all, but because some questions about ethics, about evil, about human nature must be asked repeatedly by each generation, lest we forget that the darkness that consumed Nazi medicine could, under the right conditions, consume any society that grows complacent about its moral foundations. The answers we have are incomplete. The questions we carry forward are essential. And the silence where destroyed evidence once existed reminds us that some truths are lost forever, while others are merely hidden, waiting in archives and memories and classified files for the day when full reckoning finally arrives, if it ever does.